The water wheel turned without hurry, its wooden paddles dipping into the current and rising again, dripping silver lines back into the stream. The motion was so steady that after watching it for a few minutes your own breathing would begin to match the rhythm of the creaking axle and the soft splash of water. This was the mill of Simon the Miller, and it had stood in this spot for longer than anyone in the village could clearly remember, though old Father Oswald the priest sometimes said it was mentioned in a charter from the time of the old king, the one before the one before the one now. The mill was built of local stone gathered from the fields over generations, and its roof was thatched thick with moss along the north side, where the sun rarely reached. Inside the mill, the air was different from the air outside. It was full of fine white dust that floated in the shafts of light coming through the small, high windows and settled on every surface like a gentle, constant snowfall that never melted. Simon the Miller was a man of middle years, with broad shoulders and forearms that looked like they'd been carved from the same oak as the wheel outside. His hair was the color of wheat straw dusted with the same white flour that covered everything he owned, and his eyebrows were perpetually pale with it, so that when he blinked he looked slightly surprised at the world. He had been the miller since his own father had grown too stiff to lift the heavy sacks, and now his son, a boy of about 12, named Thomas, helped him on the days when there was extra work or when Simon wanted company in the quiet of the grinding. Simon was not a man of many words. He spoke mostly to his mule when he needed the beast to move, and to the millstones when they made a sound that suggested a pebble had found its way between them. He lived in a small house attached to the mill with a single room downstairs where the fire burned and the loft above where the straw mattresses lay. His wife had died some years back of a fever that swept through the village one wet spring, and since then it had been just Simon and Thomas and the slow rhythm of the grain. On the day that matters for this account, Simon was doing what he did most days. He had lifted a sack of barley from the pile near the door and carried it across the dusty floor to the hopper. The sack was heavy, and the rough cloth bit into his shoulder through his linen tunic, but he had done this motion so many thousands of times that his body no longer registered the effort. It was simply part of the pattern of the day, like the turning of the wheel itself. He untied the cord at the neck of the sack and poured the grain into the wooden hopper, where it would funnel down through the shoe and into the eye of the upper millstone. The sound changed as the grain began to feed into the grinding surface, a deeper, steadier rumble that vibrated up through the floorboards and into the soles of Simon's feet. He stood there for a long moment, just listening. A good miller can tell by the sound alone whether the stones are set correctly, whether the grain is flowing evenly, whether the flour is coming out fine enough for the baker's purposes. Simon listened and heard nothing wrong, so he turned away and picked up a birch broom that leaned against the wall. He began to sweep the flour dust that had accumulated on the floor into a low pile near the door. The bristles made a soft, hushing sound against the warm planks, and this sound mixed with the rumble of the stones and the creak of the wheel until it all became one continuous low note, like the sound of the world breathing out. While Simon swept, his son Thomas sat on an upturned bucket near the doorway with a piece of straw in his mouth and a look of deep concentration on his face. He was watching a spider build a web in the corner where the wall met the sloping roof. The spider moved with the same unhurried purpose as the mill wheel, and Thomas found this fascinating. He had asked Simon earlier in the week about the words in the small book that Father Oswald kept on the altar. The book was a psalter, and it was written in Latin, which Thomas did not understand. Simon had told him that the words were prayers, and that the Latin tongue was the special language for talking to God. Thomas had asked why God could not understand English, and Simon had thought about this for a moment while he adjusted the tension on the millstones. He had said that he supposed God could understand any language if he wanted to, but that the church liked things done in a certain way so that everyone everywhere was saying the same words in the same order. He had added that a good heart mattered more than the shape of the words that came out of your mouth. This was the kind of thing Simon said when he was not really thinking about it. The kind of remark that drifted out of him like the flour dust drifted out of the seams in the mill's wooden walls. He had not meant anything by it. It was just a thought that had occurred to him while his hands were busy with the lever and the stone. This remark travelled out of the mill and into the village in the way that such things always travel in small places. Someone heard it. They told someone else. That person mentioned it to a neighbour while they were both drawing water from the well near the old elm tree. The neighbour repeated it to her husband while they sat by the fire that evening. The words changed slightly as they moved from mouth to mouth because that is the nature of spoken things. By the time the words reached the ears of the man who mattered for the next part of this account, the simple remark about a good heart and the shape of words had become something like this. Simon the miller said that a man could speak to God in English as well as in Latin, and that the church made too much fuss about the proper way of saying prayers. It was still not a terrible thing to say. It was not a heresy in the way that word is often imagined. It was simply an error of understanding, a small crack in the smooth surface of accepted practice. But the church in those days kept very careful track of cracks. The man who heard this version of the remark was a clerk named Brother Aldwin. He was travelling through the region on behalf of the archdeacon, whose seat was in the larger town of Lewes, some 15 miles to the east. Brother Aldwin was a thin man with a narrow face and fingers that were always stained with ink, even when he had not been writing for days. He wore the plain brown robe of a Benedictine, though he was not attached to any particular monastery, serving instead as a roving secretary for the ecclesiastical courts. His work was not exciting. It consisted almost entirely of carrying parchment from one place to another and writing down things that people said, so that those things could be filed away in chests and forgotten. He had a leather satchel that hung from his shoulder by a wide strap, and inside this satchel were several sheets of blank parchment, a small clay pot of ink sealed with wax, 3 goose quills of varying thicknesses, and a penknife with a bone handle. He also carried a piece of dried bread wrapped in a cloth and a small leather bottle filled with watered ale. He was a quiet man who did not seek conversation, but who listened carefully whenever people spoke near him. Brother Aldwin had stopped at the village inn for a bowl of pottage and a place to rest his feet. The inn was a low building, with a dirt floor covered in rushes that had not been changed since the spring. The smell was a mixture of wood smoke and old ale, and the faint animal scent of the dog that slept under the long bench near the hearth. Brother Aldwin sat in the corner near the window where the light was best for reading, though he had nothing to read at the moment. He simply liked to be able to see the sky. The innkeeper's wife brought him a bowl of pottage made from leeks and barley and a bit of salt pork. It was warm and filling, and Brother Aldwin ate it slowly, with a wooden spoon that had been worn smooth by many mouths before his. As he ate, he listened to the talk around him. 2 farmers were discussing the price of wool, and whether the weather would hold long enough to finish the harvest. A woman was telling another woman about a remedy for a cough that involved honey and the bark of a willow tree, and somewhere behind him a man's voice said something about Simon the miller and the Latin prayers. Brother Aldwin did not turn his head. He continued to eat his pottage, and he let the words settle into his memory. This was his training. When you are a clerk for the archdeacon's court, you do not leap up and demand explanations. You simply note the information and you file it away in the same careful way that you file the parchment in the leather satchel. The words were not a crime. They were not even a clear offense. They were a matter of speech, a thing said in a village that might mean something or might mean nothing. But it was Brother Aldwin's duty to record matters of speech. That was the whole purpose of his journey. The archdeacon's court was responsible for the moral condition of the diocese, and the moral condition of the diocese was understood to include the correctness of what people said about God and the Church and the sacraments. A miller who said that a good heart mattered more than Latin was not exactly wrong, but he was not exactly right either. He was standing in a grey area, and the job of the court was to map those grey areas, and if necessary, to bring them back into the clear light of correct understanding. Brother Aldwin finished his pottage and wiped the bowl with the last piece of bread from his cloth. He paid the innkeeper's wife a small copper coin, and he stood up slowly because his back was sore from the long walk. He adjusted the strap of his satchel on his shoulder, and he walked out into the afternoon light. The village was quiet. A few chickens scratched in the dust near the common green. An old man sat on a bench outside a cottage with his eyes closed and his face turned toward the weak sun. Brother Aldwin walked past the well and past the low stone wall that marked the edge of the churchyard. He could see the mill in the distance, the wheel turning steadily, the thin trail of white dust rising from the open doorway. He did not walk toward the mill. There was no need to speak to Simon the miller today. That would come later if the matter was deemed worth pursuing. For now, Brother Aldwin simply noted the location of the mill and the name of the miller and the general shape of the rumour. He would write it down in his next report to the archdeacon's official. The report would be written on a piece of parchment that would travel to Louis in the satchel of another travelling clerk. It would be read by a man who had never seen the village and never seen the mill and never tasted the flour that Simon ground. That man would decide whether the matter required a summons. The sun moved a little further toward the western hills, and the shadows of the cottages stretched across the muddy track that served as the village street. Inside the mill, Simon finished his sweeping and poured the pile of flour dust into a small barrel that he kept for feeding to his pigs. The pigs lived in a sty behind the mill, and they were fat and content. They knew the sound of the broom, and they grunted softly when they heard it, because it meant a little extra something in their trough. Simon leaned the broom against the wall and walked outside to check the sluice gate. The water was flowing smoothly, a steady grey-green ribbon that curved around the paddles and hurried away downstream toward the next village and the next mill, and eventually the sea. Simon stood there for a while with his hands on his hips, just watching the water. He was thinking about the repair he needed to make to the roof before the winter rains came. He was thinking about whether he had enough thatching straw stored in the shed. He was not thinking about Latin or prayers or the shape of words. He was thinking about the roof and the rain and the simple quiet work of keeping the mill running. Thomas came out of the mill and stood beside his father. He had finished watching the spider, and he was now chewing on a piece of barley straw. He looked up at Simon and asked if they could go fishing in the river before supper. Simon looked at the sky and judged the remaining light. He nodded once and said that they could fish for an hour, but no longer, because there was grain to be ground in the morning, and they needed to be rested. Thomas ran to fetch the willow pole and the linen line that hung on a peg inside the mill door. Simon walked slowly down to the bank, where the water was deep and still near the roots of an old willow tree. He sat down on a tussock of grass and he waited for Thomas to bring the pole. The river made its quiet sound. The mill wheel creaked behind them. The afternoon settled into evening, and the first cool breath of night began to stir the leaves of the willows. It was a peaceful time, the kind of time that fills the space between work and rest, and Simon let his mind go empty and calm, like the surface of the water, before the line was cast. In the village, Brother Aldwin had found a place to sleep in the small room above the inn that was kept for travellers. The room had a straw pallet and a single wool blanket that smelled faintly of sheep. A candle stub burned on a ledge carved into the wall. Brother Aldwin sat on the edge of the pallet and opened his satchel. He took out a sheet of parchment and his inkpot and a quill. He trimmed the quill with his penknife, making slow, careful cuts so that the nib would be just right. He unstoppered the inkpot and dipped the quill. Then he wrote in a small, neat hand the words that would begin the long, slow process of the archdeacon's inquiry. He wrote the date as he understood it. The feast of St. Michael was approaching, the year of our Lord 1300 and something. He wrote the name of the village and the name of the miller. He wrote a brief summary of the remark he had overheard. He did not add any judgment or opinion because that was not his role. He simply recorded what he had heard. When he was finished, he sprinkled a little fine sand over the wet ink to help it dry. He waited a moment and then he tilted the parchment so that sand slid off into the rushes on the floor. He folded the parchment once and then again, and he tucked it back into the satchel with the other papers. He blew out the candle and lay down on the pallet with his robe still on, because the night was cool. He listened to the sounds of the inn settling around him, the murmur of voices from below, the creak of a floorboard, the distant barking of a fox somewhere out in the fields. And then he slept. The mill wheel turned in the dark. The river flowed on. The village rested under the wide, quiet sky, and the first small seed of a bureaucratic process had been planted in the soft earth of parchment and ink. The morning light in the scriptorium at Louis was never bright. It came through high windows set in the thick stone walls, windows that were narrow and unglazed and covered only with oiled linen when the weather turned cold. The light that managed to find its way inside was grey and thin, the kind of light that seems to have been strained through water before reaching the desks. It fell in long slanted rectangles across the floorboards and across the sloped writing surfaces where the clerks sat with their quills and their ink pots and their patient, careful hands. The room smelled of old parchment and lamp oil and the faint metallic tang of iron gall ink. There was also the smell of the rushes on the floor, dried and brittle and mixed with a few crushed herbs that someone had scattered to keep the air from growing too stale. The scriptorium was not a large room. It was perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a ceiling of exposed beams that had darkened over the years from the smoke of candles and the slow accumulation of dust. Along one wall stood a row of wooden chests bound with iron straps and fitted with heavy locks. These chests held the records of the diocese, charters and wills and court proceedings and letters, and the many documents that a bishop's administration produced in the ordinary course of its work. The bishop himself was not in Lewes on this particular day. He was travelling to the northern part of the diocese, where a dispute over the boundaries of a glebe had been festering for nearly 2 years. The bishop's absence was not unusual. A bishop in the 14th century spent much of his time moving through his territory, visiting parishes and confirming children and settling the endless small disagreements that arose among the clergy and the laity. When he was away, the daily work of the diocesan administration continued under the direction of his official, a man named Master William, who held the title of Vicar General and who had been trained in canon law at Oxford many years before. Master William was a careful man with a slow, deliberate way of speaking and a habit of rubbing his thumb against his forefinger when he was thinking. He sat in a small room adjacent to the scriptorium, where he could hear the scratching of the clerk's quills through the half-open door. The sound was a comfort to him. It meant that the machinery of the diocese was functioning, that letters were being written and records kept, and the slow necessary work of governance was moving forward like water finding its level. On the morning when Brother Aldwin's report arrived in Lewes, Master William was reading through a stack of petitions that had accumulated during the previous week. One petition concerned a marriage that had been performed without the proper application of banns. Another asked for permission to build a small chapel on a manor where the Lord's wife was too ill to travel to the parish church. A third was a complaint from a rector who claimed that his parishioners were not paying the tithe on their apple harvest. These were the ordinary matters of ecclesiastical administration. They were not dramatic. They required patience and a knowledge of the relevant canons and a willingness to write letters that began with phrases like, "Whereas it has come to our attention," and ended with the bishop's seal pressed into a disc of warm red wax. Master William read each petition slowly and made small notes in the margin with a piece of lead. He would dictate his responses later to one of the clerks. For now, he was simply sorting the pile into categories: matters that required a hearing, matters that could be resolved by a letter, matters that should be forwarded to the archdeacon's court. Brother Aldwin's folded parchment was among the items that had arrived with the morning messenger. The messenger was a young layman named Walter, who rode a shaggy brown horse and carried a leather pouch slung across his chest. He had left the village where Simon the miller lived early the previous morning and had spent the night at a small priory halfway along the road. The journey was not long by modern measures, but in the slow rhythms of the 14th century, 15 miles was a full day's travel, with time to rest the horse and time to eat a bit of bread and cheese by the side of the track. Walter had handed the pouch to the porter at the gatehouse, and the porter had carried it to the scriptorium and placed it on the long table where incoming correspondence was sorted. A junior clerk had opened the pouch and removed the contents and stacked them neatly, according to their apparent importance. Brother Aldwin's report was near the bottom of the stack because it was not marked urgent and because the clerk did not recognize the name of the village or the miller. It was just another piece of paper among many pieces of paper. The report sat on the table for most of the morning while the clerks worked on other matters. The senior clerk, a man named Robert with a fringe of grey hair and spectacles made of polished bone and glass, was copying a long charter that confirmed the rights of a monastery to collect tolls on a bridge. His quill moved steadily across the parchment, forming the careful letters of the court hand, with its thick downstrokes and thin upstrokes and its elaborate loops on the ascenders. He had been copying this charter for 3 days, and he expected to finish by Vespers if his eyes held out. The junior clerk, a young man named John who was still learning to cut his quills properly, was practicing his letters on a scrap of waste parchment. He was working on the letter A, which came in several different forms depending on where it appeared in a word. His tongue stuck out slightly from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. The sound in the room was a soft, continuous whisper of nib on skin, punctuated occasionally by the clink of an inkpot being moved or the rustle of a finished sheet being set aside to dry. Around midday, Master William finished his sorting and walked into the scriptorium. He nodded to Robert and to John, and he picked up the stack of correspondence from the table. He carried it back to his room and sat down in his chair, which was a simple wooden seat with a cushion made of faded green wool. He began to read through the items one by one. He read the petition about the marriage bans and made a note to schedule a hearing for the following week. He read the request for the chapel and made a note to ask for more information about the lady's illness. He read the complaint about the apple tithe and made a note to remind the rector of the proper procedure for collecting disputed payments. And then he came to Brother Aldwin's report. The report was written on a piece of parchment that had been trimmed from a larger sheet. It was about the size of a man's hand spread wide. The ink was the standard iron gall ink that all the clerks used, a dark brownish black that would eventually eat very slightly into the surface of the skin over the course of many years. Brother Aldwin's handwriting was small and neat and legible, the hand of a man who had written many such reports and who understood that his words would be read by busy men with tired eyes. Master William read the report twice. The first time he read it quickly to get the general sense of the matter. The second time he read it slowly, his thumb rubbing against his forefinger in that habitual gesture of thought. The report stated that a miller named Simon had been heard to say that a good heart mattered more than the correct Latin words when speaking to God. It added that the miller had apparently said this to his young son, and that the remark had been repeated around the village. Brother Aldwin noted that he had not spoken to the miller himself, and that he was simply reporting what he had overheard. He ended the report with the standard formula, submitted for the consideration of the official in the ordinary course of visitation. Master William set the report down on his desk and looked out the small window at the grey sky. He was not alarmed. He was not angry. He was not even particularly interested in Simon the miller as an individual. What he was interested in was the category of the remark. The Church had developed over many centuries a detailed system for understanding and classifying statements about God and the faith. This system was recorded in the great books of canon law, in the Decretum of Gratian and the Decretals of Gregory IX, and the commentaries and glosses that surrounded them like ivy growing up the trunk of a tree. The system distinguished between different kinds of incorrect speech. There was heresy properly so called, which involved a deliberate and stubborn rejection of a defined doctrine of the faith. There was error, which involved holding an incorrect belief without the full awareness that it was incorrect. There was rash speech, which involved saying something foolish or unconsidered without really meaning to challenge the teaching of the Church. And there was simple ignorance, which involved not knowing the correct doctrine in the first place. The remark attributed to Simon the miller seemed to fall somewhere between rash speech and simple ignorance. He had not denied any article of the faith. He had simply expressed a preference for the disposition of the heart over the precision of the tongue. This was not a dangerous idea in itself, but it needed to be clarified, because it could lead to a misunderstanding about the importance of the Church's role in mediating between God and humanity. Master William reached for a clean sheet of parchment and his own quill. He wrote a brief note to himself in a hand that was looser and faster than the formal court hand he used for official documents. Simon Melendinarius de Villa Parva, dictum decorde bono et lingue latina, non videtur pertinatia sed era levis, monendos et instruendos. Simon the miller of the small village. Statement about a good heart and the Latin tongue. Does not seem to be stubbornness, but a light error. To be advised and intas si hung. There would be no dramatic trial and no severe penalty. There would be a summons because the matter had been reported, and the court could not simply ignore a report once it had been made, but the summons would be a formality, an opportunity for the miller to appear and to be told gently that his remark had been noted and that he should be more careful in the future. He would be asked to affirm that he accepted the teaching of the Church regarding the proper language of prayer and the role of the clergy in guiding the faithful. If he did so, the matter would be closed and a record of his compliance would be filed in one of the chests in the scriptorium. The process of issuing a summons was itself a quiet and methodical affair. Master William called for Robert, the senior clerk, to come into his room. Robert rose from his desk and walked the few steps to the doorway, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead. He listened while Master William explained the situation in a few calm sentences. Robert nodded and asked whether the summons should be written in the standard form for first citations. Master William said that the standard form would be appropriate, and that the date should be set for 3 weeks hence to allow time for the messenger to travel and for the miller to arrange his affairs. Robert returned to his desk and took out a fresh sheet of parchment. He trimmed it to the proper size with a sharp knife and a straight edge of smooth wood. He ruled faint lines across the page, using a piece of lead and a wooden guide, so that his writing would be straight and even. Then he selected a quill from the bundle that stood in a clay cup on his desk. He tested the nib on a scrap of parchment to make sure it was sharp and that the ink flowed smoothly. When he was satisfied, he began to write. The summons began with the name of the bishop and a recitation of his titles and authority. Then it named Simon the miller and described his village and his occupation. It stated that a matter concerning his speech had been brought to the attention of the ordinary, and that he was required to appear at the archdeacon's court in Lewes on the appointed day to answer certain questions and to receive instruction. The language was formal and a little stiff because it was the language of the law, and the law liked its words to be precise and unchanging. Robert wrote slowly and carefully, pausing occasionally to dip his quill in the inkpot and to wipe the excess ink against the rim. The letters formed on the page in orderly rows, each one distinct from its neighbours, each word a small piece of the larger machinery of ecclesiastical administration. When Robert finished the body of the summons, he left space at the bottom for the seal and for the date, and for the signature of Master William. Then he set the parchment aside to dry and he began to write a second copy, because the court always kept a record of the summonses it issued. The second copy would be filed in the chest along with all the other records of the diocese. It would sit there in the dark for years, and then for decades, and then for centuries, until perhaps some day a scholar would open the chest and find it, and wonder about the miller who had been called to court for saying that a good heart mattered more than Latin. The ink dried slowly in the cool air of the scriptorium. Robert used a blotter made of a scrap of sheepskin to press gently against the surface of the parchment and absorb the excess moisture. When he was satisfied that the ink would not smear, he folded the summons carefully. The fold was made in a particular way that created a small packet with the address written on the outside. Robert wrote the name of the village and the name of Simon the miller on the outer fold in a hand that was large enough to be read by a messenger who might not be fully literate. He set the folded summons on the corner of his desk, where it would wait until the next messenger was dispatched toward that part of the diocese. It might wait for a day or for several days, depending on the availability of messengers and the urgency of other business. The court was not in a hurry. The miller was not going anywhere. The matter was small and quiet, and it could be resolved in its own time like a slow river finding its way to the sea. While Robert worked on the summons, John the junior clerk was practicing his letters on his scrap of parchment. He had moved on from the letter A to the letter B, and he was struggling with the curve of the lower bowl. Robert glanced over at him and made a small adjustment to the boy's grip on the quill. "Hold it lightly," he said. "Let the nib do the work. You are not carving the letters into stone. You are guiding the ink across the skin." John nodded and tried again. His hand was still learning the feel of the quill, the slight give of the nib against the surface, the way the ink flowed more freely when the angle was just right. He would learn. He had time. The scriptorium would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The chests would fill slowly with parchment. The sun would rise and set, and the grey light would fall through the high windows in its thin, patient way. And somewhere in a village 15 miles away, a miller named Simon was going about his ordinary work, unaware that a piece of paper with his name on it was waiting on a clerk's desk in Lewes. The afternoon wore on. The light through the window shifted from grey to a warmer tone as the sun found a gap in the clouds. A bee buzzed against the oiled linen of one of the windows, confused by the barrier between itself and the outside air. Robert finished his copying for the day and set his quill aside. He cleaned the nib with a scrap of cloth and placed the quill back in the clay cup. He stretched his shoulders and rubbed his eyes. John had fallen asleep over his practice parchment, with his cheek resting on his arm and a small smear of ink on his nose. Robert did not wake him. The boy was young and the work was tiring, and there would be time enough for letters tomorrow. The summons for Simon the miller lay on the corner of the desk, folded and addressed and ready for its journey. It would travel in a leather pouch on the back of a shaggy brown horse. It would pass through the gatehouse and down the road past the fields and the woods and the small villages where other millers turned other wheels. It would arrive in Simon's hands, and he would hold it and turn it over and ask Father Oswald to read it to him, because he could not read the Latin himself. And then he would walk to Lewes with the mud on his boots and the flour dust in his hair, and he would stand before Master William and say that he had meant no harm. And the whole quiet process would complete its slow circle, and another piece of parchment would be filed in the chest, and the scriptorium would grow a little dimmer as the afternoon turned to evening, and the clerks blew out their candles and went to their beds. The chest in the corner of the scriptorium was made of oak darkened with age and bound with iron straps that had begun to rust in the damp English air. It had 3 locks, each with a different key, held by a different official, so that no single person could open it alone. This was the archive of the diocese, and it contained the memory of the church in that place. Inside the chest, the parchments lay in tidy stacks organized by year and by type of case. Some of them were centuries old, their ink faded to a pale brown ghost of its former self. Some of them were new and still smelled faintly of the animal whose skin had been stretched and scraped and smoothed to receive the words of men. The summons for Simon the miller would join them soon. It would take its place in the long, slow accumulation of records, and in time it would be forgotten, just as Simon would be forgotten, and the village would be forgotten, and even the name of the bishop who ruled the diocese in the year 1300 and something would be forgotten. The river would continue to flow past the mill. The wheel would turn. The grain would be ground into flour, and the flour would be baked into bread, and the bread would be eaten. And the parchment and the chest would wait in the dark for someone to open the lid and let in the thin grey light. The messenger who carried the summons to Simon the miller was a young man named Walter, the same Walter who had brought Brother Aldwin's report to Lewes some days earlier. He was not a clerk, and he wore no special livery, only a plain woolen tunic, the colour of dried mud, and a leather belt with a small pouch for the few coins he earned from his journeys. His horse was a shaggy brown creature with a patient expression and a habit of stopping to eat grass whenever Walter loosened the reins. The horse had no name that anyone used, though Walter sometimes called it Brownie when he was feeling friendly, and Dobbin when the animal was being stubborn. Together they had travelled many of the roads and tracks of the diocese, carrying letters and summonses and occasional small packages wrapped in oiled cloth. Walter could not read the words he carried, but he knew the shapes of the seals and the weight of different kinds of documents. A summons felt different from a personal letter. It was folded more tightly, and the parchment was usually of a standard size. He did not need to know what it said. His job was simply to take it from one place to another and to bring back a receipt if one was required. The morning of Walter's departure from Lewes was cool and overcast, with a sky the colour of unwashed wool. He woke in the small room above the stables where the bishop's messengers were allowed to sleep, a narrow space with a straw pallet and a single blanket and a window that looked out over the stable yard. He rose when the light was just beginning to creep over the eastern wall, and he put on his tunic and his boots, and he walked down the wooden ladder to the yard below. The stable boy had already fed Brownie a measure of oats, and the horse was standing quietly with its head over the half door of its stall. Walter saddled the horse slowly, checking the girth and the stirrup leathers and the small leather pouch that hung behind the saddle. Into this pouch he placed the folded summons for Simon the miller, along with a piece of hard cheese and a heel of bread wrapped in a cloth for his own midday meal. He also carried a leather bottle filled with water from the well. The porter at the gatehouse handed him a wooden tally stick as a record of his departure, and Walter tucked it into his belt. Then he swung up onto the horse and rode out through the gate and onto the road that led east toward the village where the mill wheel turned. The road was not a road in the modern sense. It was a track of packed earth and stones that followed the contours of the land, rising over low hills and dipping into shallow valleys where the streams crossed the path. In dry weather the surface was hard and dusty, and the hooves of the horse kicked up small clouds of pale grit that settled on Walter's tunic and on the leaves of the hedgerows. In wet weather the track turned to mud that sucked at the horse's feet and slowed the journey to a patient plodding pace. This day was neither fully dry nor fully wet. There had been rain 2 days before, and the earth was still soft in the low places, holding the shape of previous travellers' footprints and cart ruts like in memory of motion. Walter let Brownie find its own pace. There was no need to hurry. The summons was not marked urgent, and the distance was not great, and the day was long enough to reach the village before the light began to fail. The horse walked steadily with its head low and its ears flicking occasionally at the sound of a bird in the hedge or the distant bark of a dog from a farmstead hidden behind a stand of trees. The countryside through which Walter rode was a patchwork of fields and woods and small clusters of cottages. The fields were mostly harvested now, the grain cut and gathered into stooks that stood in rows like patient silent figures waiting for the cart to carry them to the barn. In some fields the stubble was already being grazed by sheep whose wool was thick and dirty from the summer dust. The sheep lifted their heads as the horse passed and then lowered them again to the short dry grass, their jaws moving in a slow continuous rhythm that matched the pace of the journey. Walter passed an old man driving a cart loaded with firewood, the wheels creaking and the ox stepping with heavy deliberate steps. The old man raised a hand in greeting, and Walter raised his own hand in return. No words were exchanged. There was no need. They were both traveling the same track in the same quiet morning, and the gesture was enough. After an hour or so, Walter stopped beside a stream, where the water ran clear over a bed of smooth brown stones. He dismounted and let Brownie drink while he sat on a fallen log and ate a piece of the cheese and bread from his pouch. The cheese was hard and salty, and it made him thirsty, so he drank from the leather bottle and then refilled it from the stream. The water was cold and tasted faintly of iron and earth. A dragonfly hovered over the surface of the stream, its wings a blur of transparent motion, and then darted away upstream toward a patch of reeds. Walter watched it go, and then he looked up at the sky. The clouds were beginning to thin in places, and patches of pale blue were showing through like glimpses of another world above the grey. He finished his bread and brushed the crumbs from his tunic and stood up slowly, because his legs were stiff from riding. He stretched his arms over his head and felt the bones in his back shift slightly. Then he climbed back onto the horse and continued along the track. The journey took most of the day. Walter passed through 2 other villages, each one a small collection of houses around a church and a green. In the first village a woman was drawing water from a well, and she looked up at the sound of the horse's hooves. Walter nodded to her, and she nodded back, and then returned to the slow work of hauling up the wooden bucket. In the second village, a group of children were playing with a hoop and a stick near the edge of the track. They stopped their game to watch the horse go by, and one of them waved. Walter waved back. The children returned to their hoop, and the sound of their voices faded behind him as the track curved around a field of barley stubble. The landscape was changing now, becoming more familiar to Walter, because he had ridden this way before on other errands. He recognized a particular oak tree that grew at a bend in the track, its branches spreading wide and low over the path. He recognized a stone marker that indicated the boundary between 2 parishes, its surface worn smooth by weather and time. And eventually he recognized the first glimpse of the village where Simon the miller lived, the thin trail of smoke rising from the cottages, and the darker shape of the mill standing beside the gleam of the river. Walter rode into the village in the late afternoon, when the shadows were beginning to lengthen across the common green. The light had softened to a warm golden color that made the thatch roofs look like they were made of honey. A few chickens scratched in the dust near the well, and a dog lay sleeping in a patch of sun with its chin on its paws. The dog opened one eye as the horse passed, and then closed it again. Walter dismounted near the inn and tied Brownie to a post where there was a trough of water. He asked the innkeeper's wife where he might find Simon the miller, and she pointed toward the mill with a flowery hand and said that Simon would be there, or in the shed behind it where he kept his tools. Walter thanked her and walked toward the mill with the folded summons in his hand. The mill was quieter now than it had been in the morning. The grinding was finished for the day, and the great wheel turned more slowly with only the natural flow of the river pushing against its paddles. The sound was a low creak and splash, not the deep rumble of stone on grain. Walter found Simon standing outside the mill door with a wooden bucket in one hand and a rag in the other. He had been cleaning the bearings of the wheel axle, a task that required patience and a willingness to reach into dark, greasy spaces. His hands were black with the mixture of old grease and fine metal dust that accumulated in the workings of the mill. He looked up when he heard Walter's footsteps on the packed earth. Simon did not recognize the young man. but he recognized the look of a messenger. There was something about the way a messenger stood, a certain formality in the posture even when the message was ordinary. Walter held out the folded parchment and said that he had been sent from the archdeacon's court in Lewes with a summons for Simon the miller. Simon took the parchment and turned it over in his hands. The grease from his fingers left a faint smudge on the outer fold, but the wax seal was intact, and the writing on the outside was clear. Simon looked at the letters and saw only shapes. He could recognize his own name when it was written, because he had seen it on the tally sticks that the baker used to record deliveries of flour. But the rest of the words were a mystery to him. He nodded to Walter and said that he would need Father Oswald to read it. Walter said that was fine, and that he would wait at the inn if Simon wanted to send a reply. Simon said he did not know yet if there was a reply to send, and Walter said he would wait anyway because his instructions were to bring back a receipt. Simon set down the bucket and the rag and walked toward the church with the summons in his hand. The church was a small stone building with a square tower that had been added 100 years before, and a roof of grey slate that gleamed dully in the afternoon light. Father Oswald was in the churchyard, not praying or meditating, but simply sitting on a stone bench beside the south wall where the sun was warmest at that hour. He was an old man with thin white hair and hands that trembled slightly when he held anything small. His eyes were clouded with the beginnings of the cataract that would eventually take most of his sight, but he could still make out large shapes, and he recognized Simon by the way he walked. Simon sat down on the bench beside him and held out the parchment. He explained that a messenger had brought it from Lewes, that it was a summons of some kind. Father Oswald took the parchment and held it close to his face. He tilted it toward the light and moved it slowly back and forth until the letters came into focus. Father Oswald read the summons aloud in a slow, halting voice, because the Latin was formal, and his own Latin had grown rusty over the years of saying Mass for farmers and shepherds. The words were strange and legal, but the meaning was clear enough. Simon the miller was requested to appear at the archdeacon's court in Lewes on a day 3 weeks hence to answer certain questions concerning a Mashera's speech that had been reported to the ordinary. The summons did not specify what the matter was. It simply stated that Simon's presence was required and that he should bring no one with him unless he wished to have a witness to his own testimony. Father Oswald finished reading and lowered the parchment to his lap. He sat quietly for a moment, looking at the grey stones of the church wall. Then he turned to Simon and asked if he knew what this was about. Simon thought for a moment and then remembered the conversation with Thomas about the Latin prayers and the good heart. He told Father Oswald what he had said and how Thomas had asked about the book on the altar. Father Oswald listened and nodded slowly. He said that it was probably nothing to worry about, a small matter of clarification, and that Simon should go to Lewes and explain himself honestly, and it would be finished. Simon sat on the stone bench beside the old priest and looked out over the churchyard. The grass was long between the grave markers, and a few late bees were moving among the clover flowers. He was not afraid. The word summons sounded serious, but Father Oswald did not seem troubled, and Simon trusted the old priest's judgment. What he felt was something closer to mild annoyance. The hearing was scheduled for a day when he had planned to repair the sluice gate that controlled the flow of water to the mill wheel. The gate was old, and the wood had begun to rot where it sat in the constant damp. If he did not replace the boards before the autumn rains came, the gate might fail and the wheel would stop turning. He asked Father Oswald if he could send a note asking for a different day. Father Oswald considered this for a moment and then shook his head slowly. He said that changing the date would require another messenger and another letter, and that it was probably more trouble than it was worth. The court did not like to rearrange its schedule for the convenience of millers. It was better simply to go and get the matter settled, and then return to the sluice gate. Simon nodded. He had expected this answer. They sat together in the warm sun for a while longer. Father Oswald asked about the mill, and about Thomas, and about whether the barley harvest had been good this year. Simon answered in short, quiet sentences. The mill was running well. Thomas was growing, and would soon be strong enough to lift the heavy sacks by himself. The barley had been decent, though the oats had suffered from a dry spell in June. These were the ordinary topics of conversation in the village, the small shared details of life that connected one person to another. After a time, Simon stood up and said he should go back to the inn and tell the messenger that he would come to Lewes on the appointed day. Father Oswald handed him the summons and said he should keep it safe and bring it with him when he travelled. Simon folded the parchment again and tucked it into the pouch on his belt. He walked back across the common green to the inn where Walter was sitting on a bench outside with a cup of small ale. Simon told Walter that he would appear as requested and that no written reply was necessary. Walter nodded and finished his ale and stood up. He said he would inform the clerk in Lewes that the summons had been delivered and accepted. Simon offered him a place to sleep in the mill if he wanted to rest before the return journey, but Walter said he preferred to start back now while there was still light. He could reach the priory halfway to Lewes by nightfall and sleep there in the guest hall. Simon understood. Messengers had their own rhythms and their own familiar stopping places. He watched Walter untie Brownie from the post and climb into the saddle. The horse turned in a slow circle and then walked back along the track that led out of the village. Simon stood by the inn for a moment, watching the shape of the horse and rider grow smaller against the green and brown of the fields. Then he turned and walked back toward the mill. The evening was settling over the village. Smoke rose from the cottages in thin, straight columns because there was no wind to bend them. The sound of the river was a constant low presence beneath the other sounds of the evening. A woman calling to a child, the distant bleat of a sheep, the creak of the mill wheel turning in its slow, idle rhythm. Simon went into the mill and found Thomas sitting on the upturned bucket again, with a piece of bread in his hand. The boy had been helping the baker's apprentice load sacks of flour onto a cart, and he was tired and content. Simon sat down on a sack of grain and told Thomas about the summons and the journey to Lewes. He said it was nothing serious, just a formality about something he had said. Thomas asked if he could come along, and Simon thought about it. He said the road was long and the court would be boring and there was work to do at the mill. Better to stay here and keep an eye on the sluice gate while he was gone. Thomas nodded. He was disappointed, but he understood. There was always work at the mill. Simon went outside again and walked down to the riverbank. He stood looking at the sluice gate with his hands on his hips. The wood was grey and soft in places where the water had worked its way into the grain. He could see the spot where a new board would need to be fitted. He would have to find a piece of oak from the pile behind the shed and shape it with the adze and fit it into place with wooden pegs. It was a day's work at least, and now that day would have to wait until after the journey to Lewes. He was not angry about this. He was simply adjusting his mental picture of the coming weeks, moving the repair of the gate from one space to another like a sack of grain shifted to a different corner of the mill. This was how he managed his life. Things came up and you dealt with them, and then you returned to the work that was waiting. The river did not care about summonses. It kept flowing and the wheel kept turning and the grain kept coming from the fields. Inside the mill house, Simon lit a small fire in the hearth and put a pot of pottage on to warm. The pottage was made from the same leeks and barley that everyone in the village ate at this time of year. It bubbled slowly and the smell filled the small room. Simon and Thomas ate their supper from wooden bowls with wooden spoons. They did not talk much because there was not much to say. After supper, Simon went up to the loft and lay down on his straw mattress. He could hear the river through the small window and the occasional creak of the mill wheel. He thought about the road to Lewes, which he had travelled only once before, when he was a young man helping his father deliver a special order of flour to the bishop's kitchen. He remembered that the road was long and that his feet had been sore by the end of it. He would wear his better boots this time, the ones with the thicker soles. He would leave early in the morning and walk steadily, and he would reach Lewes before the light failed. He would find the church where the court was held, and he would stand before the official and say what needed to be said. And then he would turn around and walk home and fix the sluice gate. This was the plan. It was a simple plan, and it gave his mind a quiet shape to rest in as he drifted towards sleep. The river flowed on in the dark. The summons lay folded in his belt pouch on the floor beside the mattress, and the village settled into the deep silence of the night. The morning of the journey to Lewes began like most mornings in the village, with the slow grey light seeping through the cracks in the shutters and the first tentative sounds of birds stirring in the thatch. You might have woken to the feeling of cool air in your face and the distant rumble of the mill wheel already turning, because Thomas had risen early to open the sluice gate and let the water do its work. The straw mattress beneath you was warm from the heat of your own body, and for a moment you considered staying there, letting the day move on without you. but the summons was folded in your belt pouch, and the road was waiting, and the sooner you walked it, the sooner you could return to the familiar rhythm of grain and stone. You sat up slowly and swung your legs over the edge of the sleeping platform. The floorboards were rough under your bare feet, worn smooth only in the places where generations of feet had passed between the bed and the door. You pulled on your woolen hose and your linen tunic, and then the heavier outer tunic that kept the morning chill from settling into your bones. Your better boots stood beside the hearth where you had left them the night before, their leather dark and supple from years of wear and occasional applications of tallow. You sat on the low stool and worked your feet into them, feeling the familiar pressure of the seams against your toes and the slight stiffness of the soles. Thomas was already awake and had stirred the embers of the fire, adding a few dry sticks to bring a small flame back to life. He did not speak because there was no need for words in the grey quiet of early morning. He handed you a piece of bread and a small round of cheese wrapped in a cloth, and you tucked them into the leather pouch that hung from your belt beside the summons. You drank a cup of water from the bucket near the door, and then you stepped outside into the yard. The air was cool and damp and smelled of the river and the wet earth and the faint sweetness of rotting leaves from the alder trees along the bank. The sky was a pale, even grey without distinct clouds, just a soft blanket of light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You looked at the mill and at the wheel and at the water flowing past, and then you turned toward the track that led out of the village and began to walk. The first part of the journey took you past the familiar shapes of the village, the church with its square tower, the common green where a single cow was already grazing, the low cottages with their thatch roofs and their thin trails of smoke. A woman was drawing water from the well, and she looked up as you passed. You raised your hand, and she raised hers, and then you were beyond the last cottage, and the village was behind you. The track ahead was the same track that Walter the messenger had ridden a few days before, though you were seeing it from a different height and at a different pace. When you walk a road that you have not walked in many years, you notice things that a rider on a horse might miss. You notice the way the track curves gently to avoid a large oak tree that must have been standing there long before anyone thought to make a path. You notice the small flowers growing in the shelter of the hedgerow, pale yellow blooms and tiny white stars and the fading purple of late knapweed. You notice the sound of your own footsteps on the packed earth, a soft regular thud that soon becomes a rhythm you no longer hear because it has merged with the rhythm of your breathing. The road rose slightly as it left the river valley and climbed toward the low ridge that separated your village from the next. The gradient was gentle, and your legs found a steady pace without any conscious effort on your part. Your mind began to drift in the way that minds drift when the body is engaged in a simple, repetitive task. You thought about the sluice gate and the piece of oak you would need to shape. You thought about the flour that was piling up in the storage bin and whether the baker would send his cart before the end of the week. You thought about Thomas and whether he would remember to check the tension on the millstones at midday. These thoughts came and went like the clouds that were now beginning to show faint variations of grey, some lighter and some darker, moving slowly across the wide, pale sky. You did not hold on to any of them. You let them pass, and then you noticed something else. A blackbird singing from the top of a hawthorn bush, a patch of rust-coloured bracken on the slope above the track, the distant shape of a man walking behind a plough in a field that had already been harvested. After an hour of walking, you reached the top of the ridge and paused to look back. The village was visible below you, small and neat in its fold of the land. You could see the mill and the glint of the river and the church tower and the patchwork of fields spreading out on either side. The smoke from the cottages rose in thin columns that leaned slightly toward the east, where a faint breeze was beginning to stir. You stood there for a moment with your hands on your hips and your breath coming easily. Your legs felt warm and loose now, the initial stiffness of the morning worked out by the steady motion of walking. You turned and continued along the track, which now descended gently toward a shallow valley where a stream crossed the path. The sound of the water grew louder as you approached, a soft rushing sound over stones, and you stopped on the simple wooden bridge to look down at the clear brown water flowing beneath you. Small fish darted in the shadows near the bank, and a water beetle rode itself across the surface with its long legs. You drank from your leather bottle and ate a piece of the bread from your pouch. The bread was slightly stale, but it tasted good in the cool air. You chewed slowly and watched the water, and felt the quiet of the valley settle around you like a blanket. The track continued on the other side of the stream and led through a stretch of woodland where the trees grew close together and the light was dimmer and greener. The leaves of the oaks and beeches were still mostly green, though there were patches of yellow and brown beginning to show at the edges. The floor of the wood was soft with years of fallen leaves, and your footsteps made almost no sound here. You noticed the smell of damp earth and mushrooms and the faint sweetness of decaying wood. A squirrel chattered at you from a high branch, and then fell silent as you passed beneath it. The wood was not large, and soon you emerged into open country again, where the fields stretched away on both sides and the track ran straight for a long distance. This was the kind of walking that required no thought at all. Your legs moved and your arms swung gently and your eyes took in the landscape without really seeing it. The clouds continued their slow drift overhead, and the light changed by imperceptible degrees from the pale grey of morning to the warmer tone of midday. You passed a cart loaded with firewood coming the other way. The driver was an old man with a face like a dried apple, and he nodded to you without speaking. The ox that pulled the cart moved with a slow, heavy patience that seemed to belong to a different order of time than your own walking pace. The cart creaked past, and the sound of its wheels faded behind you, and you were alone again with the track and the fields and the sky. You thought about the archdeacon's court, and what you would say when you stood before the official. Father Oswald had told you to be honest and to say that you meant no harm and that you accepted the teaching of the church. This seemed simple enough. You had no quarrel with the church. You paid your tithes in flour, and you attended Mass on the holy days when the mill could be left. The remark about the good heart and the Latin prayers had been nothing more than a thought that drifted out of your mouth while your hands were busy with the millstones. You did not understand why it had travelled so far, and why it now required you to walk 15 miles to stand in a stone room and repeat what you had already said. But you also understood that there were things in the world that followed their own logic, and that a miller's opinion of that logic did not change it. The water flowed downhill whether you approved of the slope or not. The sun reached its highest point and began its slow descent toward the western hills. You stopped beside a field where the stubble had been gathered into low piles, and you sat on a flat stone that some previous traveller had placed there for just this purpose. You ate the rest of your bread and the small round of cheese, and you drank from your leather bottle. The cheese was firm and slightly sharp, and it left a pleasant taste in your mouth. You watched a hawk circling high above the field, its wings barely moving as it rode the currents of air. The hawk drifted in slow circles, and then suddenly folded its wings and dropped toward the ground. You lost sight of it behind a rise, and you did not see it rise again. After a while you stood up and brushed the crumbs from your tunic and continued along the track. The afternoon brought you to the second village, the one where the children had been playing with a hoop when Walter passed through. The village was quiet now in the lull between the midday meal and the evening chores. A few hens scratched in the dust, and a dog lay sleeping in a patch of sun with its chin on its paws, just like the dog in your own village. You walked through without stopping, and the track led you out past the church and the small green, and then back into the open countryside. The landscape was changing now, becoming more open and rolling with longer views across the fields to distant lines of trees. You could see the tower of a church far ahead, probably the priory where Walter had stayed on his return journey. The sight of it gave you a measure of your progress. You had walked perhaps 2/3 of the way, and your legs were beginning to feel the distance. There was a dull ache in your calves and a tenderness in the soles of your feet where the rough stitching of your boots pressed against the skin. You adjusted your pace slightly, shortening your stride to ease the pressure, and you continued on. The road dipped into a shallow valley where a larger stream ran under a stone bridge. The bridge was old and the stones were covered with moss and lichen in shades of green and grey and pale orange. You stopped on the bridge and leaned on the low parapet, looking down at the water. It was deeper here than at the previous crossing, and it moved more slowly, forming dark pools under the shadows of the banks. A kingfisher flashed past in a streak of blue and orange and disappeared into a hole in the far bank. You watched the water for a while longer, and then you pushed yourself upright and walked on. The climb out of the valley was steeper than anything you had encountered so far, and your breath came harder and your legs burned slightly with the effort. But the top of the rise brought you to a view that stopped you for a moment. Ahead and slightly to the left you could see the town of Lewes spread out on its hill, the castle standing dark against the sky, and the church towers rising above the roofs of the houses. The sight of it made the journey suddenly real in a way it had not been before. You had been walking through a landscape of fields and woods and small villages, and now you were looking at the place where the summons had come from. The place where the official sat in his room and wrote letters and decided what was error and what was not. You walked the last few miles with the town growing slowly larger ahead of you. The track became wider and better maintained as you approached, with drainage ditches on either side and occasional stretches of rough cobbles in the lowest places where the mud was deepest. Other travelers appeared now, a man driving a flock of sheep toward the town market, a woman carrying a basket of eggs on her head, a group of laborers walking together with their tools over their shoulders. You passed them or they passed you, and no one spoke because you were all moving toward the same destination and there was nothing to say. The noise of the town reached you before you could see its details. The distant murmur of voices and the barking of dogs and the creak of cartwheels and the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere out of sight. The sound was different from the sounds of the village, busier and more layered, and it made you aware of how quiet your own life was in the mill by the river. You entered Lurie's through a gate in the old town wall where a man in a leather jerkin sat on a stool and watched people pass. He did not stop you or ask your business. You were just another traveler in dusty boots and a plain tunic, the kind of person who passed through the gate every day without being noticed. The streets inside the wall were narrow, and the houses rose high on either side, their upper stories jutting out over the street so that the sky was reduced to a thin strip of grey above your head. The smell was different here too, wood smoke and cooking, and the sharper smell of tanning from somewhere nearby, and the general close odour of many people living near one another. You walked slowly now, because your feet were tired and because you needed to find the church of St. Anne, where the archdeacon's court was said to sit. You asked a woman who was sweeping the step of her door, and she pointed toward a street that led uphill toward the castle. You followed her direction, and soon you saw the tower of the church rising above the roofs. The church of St. Anne was a large building of grey stone, with a south porch that projected out into the churchyard. The porch was the place where the court was held when the weather allowed, or so you had been told. It was a simple structure with stone benches along the sides and a vaulted ceiling of stone ribs that met in carved bosses. The afternoon light came through the open archway and fell in a warm rectangle on the flagstone floor. There were a few people waiting in the porch when you arrived. An old man with a walking stick, a young couple who stood close together and spoke in low voices, a woman in a widow's veil who sat alone on one of the benches. They looked up when you appeared and then looked away again, because you were just another person with business before the court. You found a space on one of the benches and sat down heavily, grateful to be off your feet. The stone was cool through your tunic and the wall behind you was solid and reassuring. You sat there for a while, letting the tiredness settle into your bones. The sounds of the town were muffled here inside the porch, reduced to a distant murmur that mixed with the cooing of pigeons in the tower above. You could hear the scratch of a quill from somewhere deeper inside the church, and you guessed that a clerk was working at a desk in the vestry. The old man with the walking stick coughed quietly into his hand. The young couple stopped talking and stood in silence looking at the carved stone arch that framed the entrance. You closed your eyes for a moment and felt the weight of the day's walking in your legs and the slight throb of your feet inside your boots. You were not anxious or afraid. You were simply tired and ready for whatever small formality awaited you. The summons was still in your pouch and you had done what it asked. Now you would wait until someone called your name and you would stand up and walk into the vestry and say what needed to be said. The stone bench was hard, but you had sat on harder things. You folded your hands in your lap and watched the rectangle of light on the flagstone shift almost imperceptibly as the sun continued its slow descent beyond the churchyard wall. The vestry of St. Anne's Church was a small room attached to the north side of the chancel, a space intended for the storage of vestments and the preparation of the priest before Mass. On the days when the archdeacon's court was in session, it served a different purpose. A long table had been brought in from the chapter house and placed beneath a single window that looked out onto a small garden of herbs and a leaning apple tree. The table was covered with a green wool cloth that had faded in patches where the sun had fallen on it over many years. Upon the cloth rested a wooden cross, a copy of the Gospels bound in dark leather. a stack of blank parchment sheets, a clay pot of ink, a bundle of quills, a penknife with a bone handle, and a small pewter dish filled with fine sand for blotting. Behind the table sat Master William the official, his chair positioned so that the light from the window fell across his left shoulder and illuminated the documents before him without shining directly into his eyes. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a narrow face and a high forehead, and hands that moved slowly and deliberately when he handled papers. Beside him at the end of the table sat Brother Aldwin the travelling clerk, who had first heard the remark about Simon the miller in the inn at the village. Brother Aldwin's satchel hung from the back of his chair, and a fresh sheet of parchment lay before him, ruled with faint lead lines and ready to receive the record of the day's proceedings. He had trimmed a new quill that morning and tested it on a scrap, and it wrote with a fine clean line that pleased him. The room smelled of old stone and candle wax, and the faint dry scent of the parchment itself. A small brazier in the corner held a few glowing coals that took the edge off the autumn chill, but did not make the room warm. The only sounds were the scratch of Brother Aldwin's quill as he wrote the heading of the day's record, the occasional rustle of Master William's sleeve against the table as he shifted a paper, and the distant murmur of the town beyond the thick walls. Outside the window the apple tree stirred slightly in a breeze that could be felt but not heard. A single yellow leaf detached itself from a branch and drifted down to the grass in a slow spiral. Simon the miller was called into the vestry by a young clerk who had been waiting in the church porch for just this purpose. The clerk had a round face and a soft voice, and he pronounced Simon's name carefully, as if he had practiced it beforehand. Simon rose from the stone bench where he had been sitting for the better part of an hour, his back stiff and his feet still sore from the long walk. He followed the clerk through the heavy wooden door that led from the porch into the body of the church, past the stone font and the rows of empty benches, and through a smaller door on the north side that opened into the vestry. The clerk stood aside, and Simon entered the room alone. He saw the table and the official and the clerk with the quill, and he stopped a few paces from the edge of the green cloth. He did not know what to do with his hands, so he clasped them in front of him and waited. Master William looked up from the paper he had been reading. His eyes were grey and calm, and they regarded Simon without any particular expression. He asked Simon to state his name and his village and his occupation for the record. Simon did so in a low, steady voice. Simon the miller, son of Robert the miller, of the village by the river, occupation miller. Brother Aldwin wrote these words down on the parchment, his quill moving with small, precise strokes. The ink was the standard iron gall ink, dark brown and slightly shiny when wet, and it sank into the surface of the parchment with a faint hissing sound that only the clerk could hear. Master William waited until the scratching stopped, and then he explained the purpose of the proceeding. He spoke slowly and clearly, using the formal language of the court, but pausing occasionally to allow the meaning of the words to settle. He said that a matter of speech had been reported concerning Simon the miller, and that the court's duty was to inquire into the nature of this speech in order to determine whether it contained any error requiring correction. He said that Simon was not accused of any crime, but was simply being asked to clarify what he had said, and to receive instruction if any instruction was needed. He asked Simon if he understood. Simon said that he did. Master William then turned to the stack of papers before him and selected a small folded sheet. This was Brother Aldwin's original report, written days earlier in the inn-room and carried to Lewes by Walter the messenger. Master William unfolded the report and smoothed it flat on the green cloth. He read it aloud in the same calm voice. The report stated that it had come to the attention of the archdeacon's visitor that one Simon the miller of the village by the river had been heard to say certain words concerning the Latin tongue and the disposition of the heart in prayer. The report did not claim that Simon had denied any article of the faith or spoken against the authority of the church. It simply noted the remark and recommended that the matter be examined in the ordinary course of visitation. Master William set the report aside and looked at Simon. He asked Simon if he recalled making such a remark. Simon thought for a moment. The vestry was very quiet. He could hear the cooing of the pigeons in the tower above and the faint rustle of the apple tree outside the window. He said that he remembered speaking to his son Thomas about the Psalter in the church and about why the prayers were said in Latin. He said that Thomas had asked why God could not understand English, and that he had answered that he supposed God could understand any language, but that the church liked things done in a certain way. He said he had added something about a good heart mattering more than the exact shape of the words. He said he had not meant to question the teaching of the church, and that he had simply been trying to answer his son's question while his hands were busy with the millstones. His voice was even and unhurried, and he looked at Master William while he spoke because he had been taught that an honest man looks at the person he is speaking to. Brother Aldwin wrote down Simon's words in a summarized form. He did not write every word exactly as spoken because the court record was not a verbatim transcript, but a formal summary of the testimony. He wrote that Simon acknowledged the remark and explained the circumstances in which it was made. He wrote that Simon affirmed his acceptance of the church's teaching and his willingness to be corrected if he had spoken in error. The quill moved across the parchment in a series of small regular loops and strokes, forming the abbreviated Latin that the clerks used for court records. The sound was soft and steady like the sound of a mouse moving in the wall. Master William nodded slowly when Simon finished speaking. He did not show any sign of approval or disapproval. His face remained calm and neutral, the face of a man who had heard many such explanations over many years, and who had learned to listen without judging until all the words were in. He asked Simon if there were any witnesses who had heard the remark, and who could confirm the context in which it was made. Simon said that his son Thomas had been present, and that the boy was too young to travel to Louis. He said that the remark had been repeated around the village, but he did not know by whom. Master William consulted another paper from his stack. This paper listed the names of 2 witnesses who had been identified by Brother Aldwin during his stay in the village. One was Roger Thatcher, and the other was Matilda the Brewster. Both were present in Lewes, having been summoned to appear as witnesses in the ordinary course of the inquiry. They had walked to Lewes together that morning, and were waiting in the church porch. Master William instructed the young clerk to bring in the first witness. The clerk disappeared through the door, and returned a moment later with Roger Thatcher. Roger was a man of middle height, with broad shoulders and hands that were rough and cracked from working with straw and reeds. His tunic was patched at the elbows, and he carried a cloth cap that he twisted nervously in his fingers as he entered the vestry. He had never been inside a church vestry before, and he was not sure where to stand. The clerk guided him to a spot beside Simon, and Roger stood there blinking in the grey light. Master William asked him to state his name and occupation, and then to describe what he had heard Simon the miller say. Roger cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that was louder than the small room required. He said that he had been passing by the mill on his way to repair a roof at the baker's house, and he had stopped to ask Simon about a sack of barley he wanted ground for his own household. He said he had heard Simon speaking to his son about the paternoster, and that Simon had said the prayer in English instead of Latin. He said Simon had stumbled on the words debts and debtors, and had said trespasses instead. He said Simon had laughed at his own mistake, and had said something about the words being hard to remember. He said he had not thought anything of it at the time because everyone stumbled over prayers now and then. He said he had mentioned it to his wife later, and his wife must have mentioned it to someone else, and that was how the words had travelled. Brother Aldwin wrote down Roger's testimony. His quill recorded that the witness confirmed hearing Simon recite the Lord's Prayer in the English tongue with some variations from the accepted Latin form. He noted that the witness did not perceive any malicious intent in the speech. The ink dried quickly in the cool air, and Brother Aldwin sprinkled a little sand over the lines to be sure. Master William thanked Roger and dismissed him. Roger looked relieved and backed out of the vestry, still twisting his cap in his hands. The door closed behind him, and the room was quiet again. The second witness was called. Matilda the Brewster entered with a firmer step than Roger. She was a woman of middle age, with a round face and strong arms, and a clean apron over her woolen dress. She had been brewing ale in the village for 20 years, and she was known for her good measure and her sharp tongue. She stood before the table and stated her name and occupation without being asked twice. Master William asked her what she had heard Simon say. Matilda said she had been at the mill to collect a sack of flour for her baking, and she had heard Simon talking to his son about the psalter. She said Simon had told the boy that a clean conscience was better than a pilgrimage if you had no shoes to walk in. She said she had thought this was a sensible thing to say, and she had told her sister about it because her sister had been worrying about not being able to afford the journey to the shrine of St. Thomas. She said she had not meant to cause any trouble for Simon, and that he was a good miller who always gave honest weight. Master William listened to Matilda's testimony with the same calm attention he had given to Roger's. When she finished, he asked her a single question. He asked whether Simon had said that a pilgrimage was worthless or unnecessary. Matilda thought about this for a moment. She said no, he had not said that. He had only said that a clean conscience was better if a person could not go. He had not spoken against pilgrimage itself. Master William nodded and thanked her, and she left the vestry with her head high. The door closed again, and the room settled into silence. Brother Aldwin finished writing the summary of Matilda's testimony and set his quill aside for a moment to flex his fingers. The joints were stiff from the long writing, and he rubbed them gently with his other hand. Master William looked down at the papers before him and then up at Simon. He said that the testimony of the witnesses confirmed Simon's own account of the remark, and that the court was satisfied that no deliberate heresy or stubborn error was present. He said that the remark about a good heart and the Latin tongue was an instance of rash speech rather than formal error, and that it required only a simple correction and instruction. He asked Simon if he was willing to receive instruction in the proper understanding of the matter. Simon said that he was. Master William then spoke for several minutes in a low, even voice about the Church's teaching on prayer and language. He explained that the Latin tongue was used in the liturgy, not because God could not understand other languages, but because it was the common language of the universal Church, a sign of unity among all the faithful across all the nations. He explained that the exact words of prayers mattered because they had been handed down through the centuries and tested by the authority of the Church to ensure that they contained no error. He explained that a good heart was indeed pleasing to God, but that a good heart should also desire to pray in the manner that the Church had established. He said that Simon had not done anything gravely wrong, but that he should be more careful in the future when speaking of such matters, especially in front of his son, who was still learning the faith. Simon listened to all of this without moving. His hands remained clasped in front of him, and his eyes remained on Master William's face. When the official finished speaking, Simon said that he understood, and that he would try to remember the correct words and teach them to his son. Brother Aldwin wrote down the instruction and Simon's response. The record now contained the complete account of the inquiry, the initial report, the summons, the appearance, the testimony, the finding of rash speech, the instruction, and the acceptance of correction. It was a tidy piece of parchment that would fit neatly into the chest in the scriptorium and take its place among the hundreds of other records of small matters resolved without drama. Master William took up his own quill and signed his name at the bottom of the record. He then took a small candle and a stick of red wax from the table. He melted the wax over the candle flame and let it drip onto the bottom edge of the parchment in a neat round pool. He pressed his seal into the warm wax, a small oval matrix engraved with a lamb and a cross, and held it there for a moment until the wax cooled and hardened. The seal was the mark of the court's authority, and it turned the parchment from a simple piece of writing into an official document that would be preserved in the archive. Simon watched the sealing with a vague curiosity. He had never seen a document sealed before, and the red wax looked bright and important against the cream color of the parchment. Master William set the sealed record aside and told Simon that the matter was concluded. He said that Simon was free to return to his village and his mill, and that no further action would be taken. He said that the court was grateful for Simon's cooperation and that he should consider the matter closed. Simon nodded and thanked the official. He was not sure if thanks were expected, but it seemed like the right thing to do. Master William inclined his head slightly and then turned his attention to the next paper in his stack. The young clerk opened the door and Simon walked out of the vestry into the body of the church. The church was empty and quiet. The light through the windows had shifted further toward evening, and the stained glass in the east window glowed with muted colors that fell in faint patches on the stone floor. Simon walked slowly down the aisle past the empty benches and the stone font and out through the south porch into the churchyard. The air outside felt fresh and cool after the close atmosphere of the vestry. Roger the Thatcher and Matilda the Brewster were waiting near the gate, and they looked up when Simon appeared. Roger asked how it had gone, and Simon said it was finished, and there was nothing more to worry about. Matilda said she was glad, and that she had always known Simon was a good man. They stood together for a moment in the fading light, and then Roger said they should find a place to sleep before starting back to the village in the morning. Simon agreed. His legs were tired and his feet were sore, and the thought of walking 15 miles back to the mill tonight was not a thought he wanted to entertain. There was a guest house near the church where travelers could sleep on straw pallets for a small fee, and they decided to go there together. The guest house was a long, low building with a thatch roof and a single room filled with pallets arranged in rows. A fire burned in a hearth at one end, and the smoke drifted up to a hole in the roof and out into the evening sky. Simon paid the keeper a small copper coin and found a pallet near the wall. He lay down with his boots still on because the floor was cold and because he was too tired to bend down and pull them off. Roger and Matilda found pallets nearby, and soon the room was quiet, except for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the other travelers. Simon lay on his back, looking up at the dark underside of the thatch where the smoke had blackened the straw over many years. He thought about the mill and the river and the sluice gate that still needed repairing. He thought about Thomas and whether the boy had remembered to close the gate at the proper time. He thought about the red wax seal on the parchment and the way it had looked in the grey light of the vestry. These thoughts came and went like the clouds he had watched on the road, and after a while they faded into the soft grey nothing that comes just before sleep. The fire burned low and the room grew dimmer, and the sound of the town outside faded to a distant murmur. Simon closed his eyes and let the tiredness take him. The parchment with his name on it lay on the table in the vestry, waiting to be filed in the chest, with all the other records of small matters resolved. And the river at home continued to flow past the mill in the dark, steady and patient, and entirely unconcerned with the words of men. The morning after the hearing dawned grey and still over the town of Louise. You woke on the straw pallet in the guest house with the smell of old smoke in your nostrils and the distant sound of a cock crowing somewhere beyond the walls. The room was dim, and the other travellers were still sleeping, their breathing a soft continuous rustle like wind through dry reeds. You lay there for a while without moving, letting the stiffness of the long walk settle into a dull ache that was almost pleasant, because it meant you had done what needed to be done, and now there was nothing left but the return journey. The pallet was not uncomfortable, though it was thinner than your mattress at home, and the straw had been pressed flat by many bodies before yours. You could feel the rough texture of the packed earth floor through the thin layer of straw beneath you. A pale rectangle of light showed where the door did not quite meet the threshold, and you watched it grow slowly brighter as the morning advanced. After a time you sat up and rubbed your face with your hands. The skin felt dry and tight from the road dust and the cool air of the vestry the day before. You pulled on your boots, which you had finally removed before sleep, and you stood up carefully so as not to disturb the others. Roger the thatcher was still asleep on a pallet near the wall, his mouth slightly open and his cap clutched in one hand. Matilda the Brewster had found a corner near the hearth where the embers still gave off a faint warmth, and she slept with her back to the room. You stepped over the outstretched legs of a man you did not recognize and made your way to the door. The latch lifted with a soft click, and you stepped outside into the grey morning. The air was cool and damp, and it smelled of wood smoke and the river that ran through the lower part of the town. The street was nearly empty at this hour. A dog trotted past with its nose to the ground, and a woman in a dark shawl was walking toward the church with a basket on her arm. The sky was the same pale, even grey it had been the day before, a soft blanket of cloud that seemed to press the light down toward the earth. You stood in the doorway of the guest house for a moment and breathed the fresh air and felt the quiet of the morning settle around you. The hearing was over. The record had been written and sealed. The official had said the matter was closed. All that remained was to walk home and fix the sluice gate and return to the steady rhythm of the mill. Roger emerged from the guest house a short while later with his cap on his head and his eyes still heavy with sleep. He nodded to you and asked if you knew where a man could find something to eat before the walk back. You said you did not know the town well, but there was bound to be a baker or a cook shop open somewhere near the market. The two of you walked together down the narrow street toward the sound of voices and the smell of fresh bread. You found a small stall where a woman was selling loaves still warm from the oven, and you each bought a round flat loaf and a piece of hard cheese. There was a stone wall nearby that bordered the churchyard, and you sat on it side by side with your breakfast in your hands. The bread was good, coarse and dark, and slightly sour from the leavening, and the cheese was the same hard, salty kind that Walter the messenger had eaten on his journey. You ate slowly, without speaking much. There was a comfort in the silence and in the shared act of eating before a long walk. Roger finished his bread and brushed the crumbs from his tunic. He looked at you and said he was sorry if his words had caused any trouble. He had not meant to set the archdeacon's men on you. He had only mentioned the business about the prayer to his wife, and she had told her sister, and somehow the words had travelled all the way to Luz. You told him there was no harm done, and that the official had said it was a small matter of rash speech and nothing more. Roger nodded and seemed relieved. He said he had worried about it all the way to Louis and that he would be glad to get home and see to his own work. The roof of the baker's shed still needed patching, and the autumn rains would not wait. You said you had a sluice gate that needed the same attention. You sat together on the wall for a while longer, watching the town wake up around you. A cart passed loaded with barrels, and the driver called out a greeting to someone you could not see. The church bell rang once for the morning office, and the sound hung in the grey air like a single drop of water suspended before falling. Matilda joined you at the wall with her own bread and cheese. She had stopped to speak to a woman she knew from a neighbouring village, and she brought news that the road was dry and the walking would be good. She sat down on the wall and ate her breakfast with the same unhurried pace. When she finished, she wiped her hands on her apron and said that she was ready to start back whenever the two of you were. You stood up and stretched your legs, and the three of you began the walk out of Luz together. The road out of the town was the same road you had entered by the day before, but it looked different in the morning light, with the town behind you and the open country ahead. The track led past the last houses and the town wall and the gates where the man in the leather jerkin still sat on his stool watching people pass. He nodded as you went by, and you nodded back. Then you were on the open road with the fields spreading out on either side and the low ridge visible in the distance where you had first seen the towers of Lures. The walking was easier now than it had been on the way to the town. Your legs were tired from the previous day, but the tiredness was a familiar thing, and it did not slow you. You fell into a steady rhythm that matched the pace of Roger and Matilda, who walked beside you in a comfortable silence. The three of you made a small group on the wide track, your footsteps falling softly on the packed earth and the occasional stone. While you walked, your mind drifted back to the vestry and the words that Master William had spoken. You thought about the distinction he had made between error and stubbornness. He had used a Latin word that you did not know, pertinacia. The clerk had written it down, and you had seen the shape of it on the parchment, though you could not read it. Master William had explained that the law of the church made a careful distinction between a person who said something wrong without knowing it was wrong, and a person who said something wrong and refused to be corrected. The first was error and required only instruction. The second was stubbornness and required a different kind of response. You had not been stubborn. You had said that you would learn the correct words and teach them to your son. That was all the court needed. The matter was closed. This distinction was written in the great books of canon law that sat on the shelves of the scriptorium in Leys, the Decretum of Gratian, a vast collection of texts and commentaries compiled in the previous century, devoted many pages to the question of how to judge the speech of the faithful. The glosses that surrounded the main text, like ivy on a wall, added further distinctions and refinements. A person might speak from ignorance, and ignorance could be simple or affected. A person might speak from error, and error could be light or grave. A person might speak from malice, and malice changed the nature of the act entirely. The law was a patient and careful thing. It did not rush to judgment. It looked at the circumstances and the intent and the willingness of the speaker to be corrected. Simon the miller had spoken from a simple desire to answer his son's question. He had not meant to challenge the teaching of the church. When told that his words were not quite right, he had accepted the correction without argument. This was the pattern of a good Christian who had made a small mistake. The record would reflect this, and the matter would rest in the archive. The road rose gently toward the ridge, and you climbed it with the same steady pace. At the top you paused to look back at Lewes. The town sat on its hill, with the castle dark against the grey sky, and the church towers rising among the roofs. It looked smaller now than it had when you were inside its walls. The smoke from the morning fires rose in thin columns that leaned with the faint breeze. You thought about the official sitting in his vestry with his papers and his seal and his careful distinctions. He would hear other cases today and write other records and seal them with red wax. Your case was already filed in his mind as a matter completed. By evening it would be in the chest in the scriptorium with all the other completed matters. The chest would sit in the dim light of the high windows, and the dust would settle on its iron straps, and the years would pass. You turned away from the view and continued along the track. The descent from the ridge was easier than the climb, and your legs felt looser now. Roger began to talk about the thatching work that waited for him at home. He described the bundle of reeds he had gathered from the marsh and the way he would layer them on the baker's roof to keep out the rain. His voice was low and steady, and it blended with the sound of your footsteps. Matilda added a comment about the quality of the reeds in the marsh this year, saying they were thicker than usual because of the wet spring. You listened without needing to respond. The conversation was a soft background noise like the sound of the river at home. After a time you reached the shallow valley where the stream crossed under the stone bridge. The water was still clear and brown, and it made the same soft rushing sound over the stones. You stopped on the bridge and leaned on the parapet just as you had done the day before. Roger and Matilda stopped with you, and the three of you looked down at the water in silence. A small fish rose to the surface and took something invisible and disappeared again. The kingfisher was not there today, or if it was, it stayed hidden in its hole in the bank. You drank from your leather bottle and offered it to the others. Roger drank and Matilda drank, and then you continued on. The road led through the stretch of woodland where the trees grew close and the light was dimmer. The leaves were further along in their turning now, more yellow and brown showing among the green. A few had fallen and lay on the track in patches of colour that your feet disturbed as you passed. The smell of damp earth and mushrooms was stronger today, and you breathed it in deeply. The wood was quiet except for the rustle of a bird in the undergrowth and the distant tap of a woodpecker somewhere deeper among the trees. You walked through the wood and out the other side into the open fields again. By midday you had reached the village where the children had been playing with a hoop. The village was busier now than it had been on your outward journey. A group of men were repairing a section of the fence that bordered the common green, and they looked up as you passed. A woman was hanging, washing on a line strung between two apple trees, and the white cloth moved gently in the faint breeze. You walked through without stopping, and the track led you on toward the next stretch of open country. Your legs were tired now in a deeper way, and you could feel the miles in the soles of your feet and in the small of your back. But the tiredness was manageable, and the thought of home pulled you forward. Roger and Matilda talked less as the afternoon wore on. The walking required more of their attention now, and they saved their breath for the road. The sky remained grey and even, the same soft blanket of cloud that had covered the land since morning. The light changed slowly from the pale grey of midday to the warmer grey of afternoon, and the shadows under the hedgerows deepened slightly. You passed the field where the stubble had been gathered into low piles and the flat stone where you had sat to eat your bread the day before. You did not stop this time. You were close enough to home now that stopping felt like a delay you did not want to accept. The final stretch of the journey brought you to the top of the last low rise that overlooked your own village. The sight of it was a quiet relief. The church tower and the mill and the river and the patchwork of fields all lay below you in the grey afternoon light. The smoke from the cottages rose in thin columns, and the mill wheel turned in its slow, steady rhythm. You could see the dark shape of the sluice gate from here, and you made a mental note to look at it in the morning. Roger and Matilda would continue to their own homes at the other end of the village. You parted from them at the edge of the common green with a few quiet words. Roger said he would see you at the mill when he needed his next sack of barley ground. Matilda said she would bring you a jug of her new ale when it was ready. You thanked them both and turned toward the mill. The track to the mill was short and familiar. You walked it with a slower step now, letting the tiredness settle into your bones without fighting it. The river was on your left, and the sound of it grew louder as you approached the mill. The wheel was turning, and the low rumble of the stones came from inside the building. Thomas must have started the grinding on his own, using the grain that had been left in the hopper from the day before. You felt a small pride in this. The boy was learning, and soon he would be able to run the mill by himself when you needed to be away. Thomas was standing in the doorway of the mill when you arrived. He had a broom in his hand, and his face and arms were dusted with flour. He looked at you with a question in his eyes, and you told him that the matter was finished and there was nothing to worry about. He nodded and went back to his sweeping. You went inside and sat down heavily on a sack of grain. The familiar smell of the mill surrounded you, the dry sweetness of the flour, the faint oiliness of the bearings, the clean smell of the river water that seeped through the stone walls. You closed your eyes for a moment and let the sound of the stones fill your ears. It was the sound of home, and it was the sound of work waiting to be done. After a while, you stood up and went outside to look at the sluice gate. The wood was grey and soft in the places you had noted before. You ran your hand over the surface and felt the grain beginning to separate where the water had worked its way in. A new board would need to be fitted, and the pegs would need to be replaced. You would start in the morning after a good night's sleep. The river flowed past the gate in its steady, unhurried way. The same river that had been flowing since before the mill was built and would flow long after. You stood there for a while with your hands on your hips, just watching the water and listening to the wheel. The grey sky was beginning to darken toward evening, and the first lights of the village appeared in the cottage windows across the common green. You turned and went back inside the mill where Thomas had lit the small fire in the hearth and was putting the pot of pottage on to warm. The smell of leeks and barley filled the small room, and you sat down on the stool by the fire and waited for supper. The day was over, and the matter was closed, and the river flowed on in the dark. The morning after the hearing in Lewes, Simon woke to the sound of rain on the thatch above his head. It was a soft, steady sound, not a storm, but a patient drizzle that had begun sometime in the night and seemed likely to continue through the day. The guest house was dim and cool, and the other travellers were still wrapped in their blankets, their breathing slow and regular in the grey light. Simon lay still for a while, listening to the rain and feeling the ache in his legs from the long walk of the day before. His feet were tender where the seams of his boots had pressed against his skin, and his calves were tight from the unaccustomed miles. He did not want to move, but the thought of the mill and the sluice gate and Thomas waiting at home pulled at him like a gentle hand on his sleeve. He sat up slowly and swung his legs over the edge of the pallet and reached down to pull on his boots. The leather was cool and slightly damp from the night air, and it resisted for a moment before sliding over his heels. Roger the Thatcher and Matilda Brewster were still asleep on their pallets nearby. Simon did not wake them. They would find their own way back to the village when they were ready, and there was no need to travel together. He stood up carefully and stepped over the sleeping forms and made his way to the door. Outside, the rain was falling in a fine grey curtain that blurred the outlines of the church and the surrounding houses. The street was empty, and the mud was already softening under the steady drizzle. Simon pulled the hood of his tunic up over his head and began to walk. The track out of Lewes was the same track he had followed the day before, but it looked different in the rain. The dust that had risen in small clouds under his feet was now a thin layer of slick mud that clung to his boots and made each step feel heavier than it should. The hedgerows dripped steadily, and the leaves of the trees hung heavy with water. The sky was a uniform pale grey without any variation, the kind of sky that could last for hours or days without changing. Simon walked at a slower pace than he had on the journey to Lewes. His legs were tired, and the rain made everything feel more effortful. He stopped after an hour to rest under a large oak tree, whose branches still held enough leaves to offer some shelter. He ate a piece of bread that he had saved from the previous day and drank from his leather bottle. The water tasted flat and faintly of the leather itself. He watched the rain fall on the fields and thought about the sluice gate. The rain would raise the level of the river and put more pressure on the old wood. If the gate failed before he could repair it, the wheel would stop turning and the mill would fall silent. This thought sat in his mind like a small stone in his boot, but he did not let it grow into worry. He would reach the village by evening, and he would check the gate, and if it held through the night, he would begin the repair in the morning. The rain continued to fall, and Simon continued to walk. The journey back took longer than the journey there. The mud sucked at his boots and the rain seeped through the shoulders of his tunic where the wool was thinnest. He passed the same villages and the same fields and the same stream crossings, but everything was softened and greyed by the weather. The man with the firewood cart was not on the road. The children with the hoop were indoors somewhere warm. The only living things Simon saw were a few sheep huddled against a hedge and a single heron standing motionless in a flooded corner of a field. The heron watched him pass with its yellow eye and did not move. Simon walked on. By late afternoon the rain began to ease. The clouds thinned in the west, and a pale wash of yellow light spread across the landscape. The roofs of the village appeared ahead, and Simon felt the familiar lift of recognition that comes when you see your own place after a journey away. The mill was visible as a dark shape against the river, and he could see a thin trail of smoke rising from the house. Thomas had kept the fire going. That was good. Simon walked the last stretch of track with a little more energy, and when he reached the mill yard, he stopped and looked at the sluice gate. The water was higher than it had been and the old boards were dark with moisture, but the gate was still holding. The wheel turned slowly in the current. Thomas had adjusted the flow to keep it moving without strain. Simon stood there for a moment with the rain dripping from his hood, and then he went inside. The house was warm and dry and smelled of wood smoke and the lingering scent of the pottage Thomas had made for himself. The boy was sitting on the floor near the hearth whittling a piece of willow with a small knife. He looked up when Simon entered, and his face showed relief and curiosity in equal measure. Simon sat down on the low stool and pulled off his wet boots. He told Thomas about the journey and the vestry and the official named Master William. He told him about Roger and Matilda and what they had said. He told him that the matter was finished and that there was nothing to worry about. Thomas listened carefully, and when Simon was done he asked if anything bad had happened. Simon said no, nothing bad, just a lot of walking and a lot of waiting and a few questions. He said the official had told him to be more careful about the words he used when speaking of prayers and that Father Oswald would help him remember the right ones. Thomas nodded and went back to his whittling. The willow was slowly becoming a small boat. 3 days later the weather cleared and Simon repaired the sluice gate. He took a piece of oak from the pile behind the shed and shaped it with the adze and fitted it into place with wooden pegs. The work took most of a morning, and when it was done, he stood back and watched the water flow past the new board. The gate held firm, and the wheel turned with its old steady rhythm. Simon wiped his hands on a rag and went back to the mill to grind the grain that had been waiting. A week passed in the ordinary way. The mill ran and the flour piled up, and the baker's cart came and went. The leaves on the trees along the riverbank turned from green to yellow to brown, and some of them fell into the water and drifted away downstream. The air grew cooler, and the mornings began to show a thin edge of frost on the grass. Simon went about his work and did not think much about Louise or the vestry or the official's calm grey eyes, but he did remember the instruction that had been given to him. He was to meet with Father Oswald for 3 Sundays after Vespers to receive instruction in the proper understanding of prayer and language, and he was to sweep the porch of the church once a week for the month of Michaelmas. The first Sunday arrived with a sky that was high and pale and scattered with thin clouds like wool pulled apart. Vespers was sung in the church as the light began to fade and the villagers gathered in the nave while Father Oswald led the prayers in his wavering old voice. The candles on the altar made small pools of warm light in the gathering dimness, and the smell of beeswax mixed with the smell of damp stone and the faint earthy scent of the rushes on the floor. When the service ended, the villagers filed out into the churchyard and stood talking in low voices before walking home to their suppers. Simon remained behind, as he had been told to do. He sat on the stone bench in the south porch and waited for Father Oswald to finish putting away the vessels and the book. Father Oswald came out of the church with a small oil lamp in his hand. The flame flickered in the evening breeze and cast moving shadows on the stone walls of the porch. He sat down beside Simon and set the lamp on the bench between them. He asked Simon if he was ready to begin, and Simon said that he was ready to begin. And Simon said that he was. Father Oswald did not open a book or recite any formal text. He simply began to talk in his slow, gentle way about the nature of prayer and the reason for the church's careful keeping of words. He said that prayer was like the grinding of grain. The grain was the meaning, and the millstones were the words. If the stones were set correctly, the grain would be ground fine and even, and the flour would be good. If the stones were set poorly, the grain would be crushed unevenly, and the flour would be coarse and full of husks. The church had spent many centuries setting the stones of prayer just so, and the Latin words were part of that careful setting. Father Oswald said that this did not mean that a person who prayed in English was doing something wrong. It only meant that the Latin prayers had been tested and proven, and that they carried the weight of all the faithful who had prayed them before. Simon listened and watched the flame of the lamp move in the breeze. He understood the comparison to the millstones. It made sense to him in a way that the formal language of the court had not. They sat together in the porch for perhaps half an hour, while the sky darkened and the first stars appeared above the church tower. Father Oswald did not test Simon or ask him to repeat anything. He simply talked and Simon listened, and when the old priest was finished, he stood up and said they would meet again next Sunday. Simon thanked him and walked home across the common green. The river made its quiet sound in the dark, and the mill wheel turned with its slow creaking rhythm. Simon went inside and sat by the fire and thought about what Father Oswald had said about the millstones. It was a good way to understand it. He had spent his whole life setting stones and listening to the sound they made, and he knew that a small adjustment could change everything. He had never thought of prayers in that way before. The second Sunday came, and they sat in the porch again. This time Father Oswald talked about the words themselves, the Latin phrases that Simon had stumbled over when trying to say the Paternoster in English. He said the Latin words slowly, and Simon repeated them. Paternoster qui es in calis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. The sounds were strange in Simon's mouth, the vowels longer and the consonants softer than in English. He stumbled over sanctificetur, and Father Oswald said it again patiently. They went through the prayer several times, and by the end, Simon could say most of it without stopping. He did not understand every word, but he understood the shape of the sounds and the way they fit together. Father Oswald said that understanding would come with time, and that for now it was enough to say the words carefully and with attention. Simon nodded and walked home under the stars. The third Sunday was the last. The weather had turned colder, and they sat in the porch with their cloaks pulled tight around them. Father Oswald did not talk about Latin this time. He talked about the good heart that Simon had mentioned to Thomas. He said that Simon had been right in a way. A good heart was indeed pleasing to God, but a good heart was not separate from the words and the actions of a person. A good heart wanted to do things rightly, to say prayers in the way the church taught, to treat others with fairness, to give honest weight and honest measure. Simon thought about this and saw the truth in it. He had always given honest weight in his milling, not because anyone was watching, but because it was the right way to do the work. The prayers were the same. You said them rightly because it was the right way to pray. Father Oswald smiled when Simon said this. He said that Simon had understood the instruction perfectly. He said there was no more need for meetings in the porch. Simon thanked him, and they sat together for a while longer in the cold evening air, watching the stars wheel slowly above the church tower. In addition to the Sunday meetings, Simon was required to sweep the porch of the church once a week for the month of Michaelmas. Michaelmas fell at the end of September, and the month that followed was a time of shortening days and falling leaves and the gradual turning of the year toward winter. Simon chose Thursday afternoons for his sweeping because Thursday was usually a slower day at the mill. He would finish the grinding by midday and walk across the common green with the birch broom from the mill over his shoulder. The broom was the same one he used to sweep the flour dust from the mill floor, and it was worn smooth at the handle from years of use. The bristles were made of birch twigs bound together with strips of willow bark, and they made a particular sound when they moved across stone. The first Thursday Simon arrived at the church porch and found it covered with a scattering of dry leaves and a fine layer of dust and the small debris that accumulated in any sheltered space. He began to sweep. The broom moved in long, even strokes from the back of the porch toward the open archway. The sound was a soft, regular swish, 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 the bristles catching on the rough flagstones and then releasing. The leaves gathered in a small pile near the entrance, and the dust rose in a thin cloud that caught the afternoon light and drifted slowly out into the churchyard. Simon worked without hurry. There was no one watching and no one measuring his progress. He simply moved the broom back and forth and watched the floor grow cleaner by small degrees. When he reached the threshold, he swept the pile of leaves and dust out onto the grass where the wind would take it away. Then he stood the broom against the wall and looked at his work. The flagstones were a pale grey now instead of a dusty brown, and the worn places where generations of feet had passed showed their smooth surfaces clearly. The second Thursday was colder, and a sharp wind was blowing from the north. The porch had collected more leaves than before, and there was a small bird's nest that had fallen from somewhere in the rafters. Simon swept it all out with the same slow, steady motion. The wind tried to push the leaves back into the porch, but Simon worked against it patiently, guiding the debris toward the archway and out into the churchyard, where it scattered across the grass and disappeared. An old woman from the village passed by while he was sweeping and nodded to him. She did not ask what he was doing because everyone in the village knew about the summons and the penance, and they all understood that it was a small thing, nothing to remark upon. Simon nodded back and continued sweeping. The third Thursday was wet, and the porch was dark with moisture. The flagstones were slippery, and Simon swept more carefully to avoid disturbing the thin film of water that lay on the surface. The broom made a different sound on the wet stone, a softer sound with less of the dry scratch. The leaves were heavy with water, and they clumped together and were harder to move. Simon took his time and worked in smaller strokes, gathering the wet leaves into a pile, and then pushing the pile out into the rain. The rain fell steadily on the churchyard and on the roofs of the village and on the river. Simon stood in the shelter of the porch for a moment, watching the rain, and then he walked back to the mill with the broom over his shoulder. The fourth Thursday was the last. The month of Michaelmas was nearly over, and the days had grown short. The light in the afternoon was thin and golden, and the shadows were long across the common green. Simon swept the porch for the final time. The flagstones were dry and the leaves were crisp, and they moved easily under the broom. Swish, 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 swish. The sound was the same as it had been the first week, and the second and the third. When the porch was clean, Simon stood for a moment looking at the smooth grey stones and the carved arch above the entrance and the dark wooden door that led into the church. He felt no particular emotion. The sweeping had not felt like punishment. It had felt like a quiet pause in the week, a small task that had a beginning and a middle and an end. He had done what was asked, and now it was finished. He walked back to the mill and hung the broom on its peg inside the door. While Simon was walking home from the church on that fourth Thursday, Brother Aldwin was sitting in the scriptorium at Lewes with a sealed parchment before him. The record of Simon's case had been waiting on a shelf for several weeks while other matters were attended to. Now it was time to file it properly in the archive chest. Brother Aldwin took the parchment and read it through one last time to be sure that everything was in order. The testimony was complete. The finding was clear, the instruction was recorded, and Simon's acceptance of correction was noted. The red wax seal was intact, and the official's signature was dry and dark on the page. Brother Aldwin turned the parchment over and wrote on the back in his small, neat hand, Causa similis molendinari de errore verborum, absolutis commonitione. The case of Simon the Miller concerning error of words. Absolved, with a warning. The ink sank into the surface of the parchment, and Brother Aldwin sprinkled a little sand over it and waited for it to dry. When the ink was dry, he folded the parchment carefully, first one side and then the other, making a neat rectangle that would fit into the chest without being crushed. He opened his leather satchel and placed the folded parchment inside along with the other documents that were ready for filing. The satchel was old and soft, and the leather had darkened to a deep brown where his hands had touched it over the years. The strap was worn smooth, and the buckle was polished from use. Brother Aldwin closed the flap of the satchel and drew the strap through the buckle and pulled it tight. The sound of the buckle fastening was a small, precise click that echoed softly in the quiet room. He lifted the satchel and carried it across the scriptorium to the row of chests along the wall. The chest for the current year's records was the third from the left, and it was made of oak, darkened with age and bound with iron straps. Brother Aldwin knelt down and set the satchel on the floor. He opened the chest, and the smell of old parchment and dry wood rose up to meet him. Inside the chest, the records were stacked in tidy bundles tied with linen tape. Brother Aldwin found the bundle for cases of minor correction, and he untied the tape and slipped Simon's folded parchment into its proper place among the others. He retied the tape and closed the lid of the chest. The iron hinges made a soft groaning sound, and the lid settled into place with a solid thump. Brother Aldwin stood up and brushed the dust from the knees of his robe. He picked up his satchel and walked back to his desk. The satchel was lighter now without the parchment inside, but it still held the other tools of his work, the spare quills and the ink pot and the penknife and the scrap of cloth for cleaning. He set the satchel on the floor beside his chair, where it would wait until the next journey. Outside the window the light was fading and the scriptorium was growing dim. The other clerks were putting away their work and preparing to leave for the evening meal. Brother Aldwin stayed at his desk for a while longer, looking at the chest in the corner. The records inside it would sit there in the dark for years, and then for decades, and then for centuries. The case of Simon the Miller would be forgotten along with all the other small cases of small errors and small corrections. But for now, the work was done. The parchment was filed, the satchel was empty, and the quiet afternoon in the scriptorium settled into evening like a stone sinking slowly into still water. The chest in the corner of the scriptorium at Luez remained closed for a very long time after Brother Aldwin placed Simon the Miller's folded parchment inside it and lowered the heavy lid. Years passed in the way that years pass in old stone buildings where the light falls through high windows and the dust settles in thin, even layers on every surface. The scriptorium continued to be used by clerks who came and went, some growing old at their desks while their quills wore down and their eyesight dimmed, others arriving as young men with smooth faces and leaving as older men with stooped shoulders and fingers permanently stained with ink. The work of the diocese did not change in its essential nature. Letters were written and sealed, summonses were issued and answered, records were kept and filed and forgotten. The chest in the corner received new documents each year, and the bundles inside grew thicker, and the weight of the accumulated parchment pressed down on the layers below. 50 years is not a very long time in the life of a stone building or a river or an archive. It is long enough for a child to be born and grow to adulthood, and raise children of their own, and grow old and be laid to rest in the churchyard. It is long enough for the thatch on the cottage roof to be replaced 3 times, and for the wooden paddles of a mill wheel to be changed twice. It is long enough for memories to fade, and for the exact shape of a person's face to be lost even to those who once knew them well. In the village by the river where Simon the Miller had lived and worked and swept the church porch, the people who remembered him as a man with flour in his hair and a quiet way of speaking had themselves grown old or passed away. His son Thomas had taken over the mill when Simon's shoulders grew too stiff to lift the heavy sacks. Thomas had married a woman from the next village, and they had raised their own children in the small house attached to the mill. And in time, Thomas too grew old, and his son John, Simon's grandson, became the miller. The wheel turned, and the river flowed, and the grain was ground into flour. The name Simon was remembered by a few of the oldest villagers as the name of the miller, before Thomas, the one who had walked to Louis once for some small matter with the church. But the details of that matter were lost. No one remembered the remark about the Latin prayers or the summons or the 3 Sunday evenings in the porch with Father Oswald. Those things had faded into the general grey past, where most of the small events of human life eventually go. In the scriptorium at Louis, the chest sat undisturbed for most of those 50 years. It was opened occasionally when a clerk needed to consult an old record, or when a new bundle of documents was added to the collection. Each time the lid was lifted, the same smell rose up, the dry scent of old parchment and the faint mustiness of wood that had been closed away from the air. The iron straps on the chest developed a fine orange bloom of rust, where the dampness of the English climate had worked its way into the metal. The locks were oiled from time to time by a porter whose duties included the care of the archive, but otherwise the chest was left to its quiet occupation of holding the past. Inside the chest, the parchment sheets breathed with the changing seasons. Parchment is made from the skin of sheep or goats or calves, and even after it has been scraped and stretched and dried, it retains a memory of the living animal. It responds to the moisture in the air, expanding slightly in the damp of winter and contracting in the dry warmth of summer. Over the course of 50 years, these small movements accumulated. The folded edges of Simon's summons and the record of his hearing softened and relaxed. The sharp creases that Brother Aldwin had made with his careful fingers became rounded and gentle. The surface of the parchment darkened by small degrees from the pale cream of new skin to a warmer honey brown. This darkening was caused by many things: the slow oxidation of the skin itself, the faint acidity of the ink, the dust that settled into the microscopic texture of the surface, the occasional touch of a clerk's finger leaving behind the invisible oils of human skin. The change was so gradual that if you'd been able to watch the parchment continuously for all those years, you would not have noticed it happening. It would have been like watching a tree grow or a river wear down a stone. The ink on the parchment also changed with time. iron gall ink is made from oak galls and iron salts and gum arabic, and it goes onto the page a dark brownish black. Over decades, the iron in the ink reacts with the air and with the parchment itself, turning from black to a deep rust brown. In some places where the clerk had pressed harder with the quill, the ink had bitten very slightly into the surface of the skin, creating a fine channel that would remain visible even if the color faded entirely. The words that Brother Aldwin had written, and the signature that Master William had added, and the red wax of the seal, all remained legible and clear. The record of Simon the Miller's small error was preserved as perfectly as the day it was filed. The scriptorium itself changed little in those 50 years. The high windows still admitted their thin grey light. The sloped desks still bore the scratches and ink stains of generations of clerks. The rushes on the floor were changed periodically, and the smell of dried herbs and dust remained constant. The clerks who worked at the desks were different men now. Robert, the senior clerk with the spectacles of polished bone, had died some 20 years after Simon's case, his heart stopping quietly one night while he slept in his small room near the chapter house. John, the junior clerk, who had practiced his letters on scraps of waste parchment, was now a senior clerk himself, with his own fringe of grey hair and his own young assistant to train. The assistant was a thin, serious boy named Edmund, who had been sent to Lewes from a village in the north of the diocese. He was learning to cut his quills and rule his lines and form the letters of the court hand with the same careful attention that John had learned from Robert all those years ago. The work continued. The archive grew. One autumn afternoon in the 50th year after Simon's hearing, a scholar arrived at the scriptorium. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, with a narrow face and a scholar's stoop, and a leather satchel much like the one Brother Aldwin had carried. His name was Peter, and he had been sent by the bishop to examine certain old records concerning the boundaries of a glebe that had been disputed for nearly a century. The dispute had flared up again because a new lord had inherited the manor, and he was questioning the ancient arrangement. Peter's task was to find any documents that might shed light on the original agreement. He was given a seat at a small table near the window and permission to open the older chests in the archive. Peter began with the chest for the current year and worked his way backward through time. He opened each chest carefully and lifted out the bundles of parchment and untied the linen tapes. He read through charters and wills and court records and letters, his eyes moving slowly across the faded script. The afternoon light fell across his table and illuminated the dust that rose from the old documents each time he moved a bundle. The dust was fine and pale, and it hung in the air for a moment before settling again. It was made of tiny particles of parchment fibre and dried ink and the general accumulation of years. It smelled of age and stillness and the slow, patient work of time. Peter worked through the chests methodically. The chest for 40 years passed, then 45, then 50. When he opened the chest for the 50th year, he found the bundles neatly stacked, just as Brother Aldwin had left them. He lifted out the bundle of cases of minor correction and untied the linen tape. Inside were perhaps 30 folded parchments of various sizes, each one a small record of a small matter resolved without drama. Peter was not looking for these. He was looking for land records and boundary descriptions, but his eye was caught by a name on the back of one of the folded sheets. Simon Molendenarius, Simon the Miller. The name meant nothing to him, but the Latin word for miller was clear, and the handwriting was neat, and the parchment had aged to a pleasant warm color. Peter unfolded it out of simple curiosity. He read the record slowly. His lips did not move, but his mind formed the Latin words as his eyes passed over them. The report from the visitor. The summons issued. The appearance of Simon the Miller, and the witnesses, Roger the Thatcher and Matilda the Brewster. The testimony about the Lord's Prayer said in English, and the remark about a good heart and a clean conscience. The finding of rash speech rather than formal error. The instruction given and accepted. The penance of sweeping the church porch. The seal of the official in red wax, now faded to a dull brown. Peter read it all, and when he finished he sat for a moment looking at the parchment in his hands. The matter was so small, so quiet, so entirely resolved. It had none of the drama that people sometimes imagined when they thought of the ecclesiastical courts. It was just a miller who had said something slightly wrong and had been told to say it rightly, and had done so. Peter folded the parchment again and placed it back in the bundle. He retied the linen tape and returned the bundle to the chest. He did not make any note of Simon's case because it had nothing to do with the glebed boundaries he was searching for. He simply closed the lid of the chest and moved on to the next one. The record of Simon the miller returned to the dark and the dust and the slow breathing of the parchment. It would wait there for another 50 years, and then another 50, and then more. It would wait until the chest was moved to a different room or a different building. It would wait until the scriptorium itself was no longer used by clerks and the archive was transferred to a new location. It would wait until scholars with different questions came looking for different things, and through all that waiting it would remain what it had always been. A piece of paper in a box, a small mark of a small life, a quiet record of a quiet matter that had been closed long ago. Outside the scriptorium, the town of Louis went about its ordinary business. The market was held in the square and the farmers brought their produce and the traders called out their wares. The castle on the hill was repaired and reinforced and then neglected and then repaired again. The river that ran through the lower part of the town flowed on toward the sea, passing other villages and other mills on its way. And, in one of those villages, the village where Simon had lived and worked and swept the church porch, the mill wheel still turned. John the miller, Simon's grandson, was a man of middle years now, with flour in his hair and a quiet way of speaking. He had heard stories about his grandfather from his father Thomas, who'd heard them from Simon himself. The stories were simple ones, how Simon had walked to Lewes once for a matter with the church, how he had said something about prayers and been told to be more careful, how he had swept the church porch for a month and then returned to his work. John did not know the details. He did not know about the Latin words, or the witnesses, or the red wax seal. He only knew that his grandfather had been a good miller, who gave honest weight and who had once walked a long way to answer some questions. The story was not important. It was just a small thread in the fabric of the family's life, like the memory of a particular harvest or the knowledge of which field had the best barley. The river continued to flow past the mill. The water that had turned the wheel in Simon's time was long gone to the sea, and new water had come from the hills to take its place. The wheel itself had been repaired and rebuilt several times over the decades. The original oak axle had been replaced by John's father Thomas, and the paddles had been changed one by one as they wore out. The millstones were the same ones that had ground grain in Simon's day, because millstones last for a very long time if they are cared for properly. They had been dressed and sharpened many times, and their surfaces were smooth in some places and rough in others. The sound they made when they turned was the same deep rumble that Simon had listened to while he swept the floor and thought about the sluice gate and answered his son's questions about Latin prayers. The sound did not change because the stones did not change, and the grain did not change, and the work did not change. It was a sound that belonged to the place as much as the sound of the river itself. In the village, the church of St. Anne, where the archdeacon's court had been held, was still standing. The south porch where Simon had sat with Father Oswald, and later swept with his birch broom, was still there, its stone benches worn smoother by 50 more years of use. The flagstones on the floor had been walked upon by hundreds of feet and swept by many hands. The dust that Simon had pushed out into the churchyard had long since scattered and mixed with the soil and been rained upon and grown into grass. New dust had accumulated and been swept away in its turn. The cycle of cleaning and soiling and cleaning again continued without end, a small, quiet rhythm that matched the turning of the mill wheel and the flowing of the river. The chest in the scriptorium sat in the dim light of the high windows. The dust that had risen when Peter the scholar opened the lid settled slowly back onto the bundles of parchment. The iron straps continued their slow rusting. The wood of the chest continued its slow drying and shrinking and adjusting to the weight of the years. Inside the bundle of minor corrections, Simon's folded parchment lay among the others, its honey-brown surface darkening by imperceptible degrees. The ink that spelled out his name and his error and his acceptance of correction continued its slow chemical change, the iron salts reacting with the skin and the air and the faint moisture of the English climate. The words remained legible and would remain legible for centuries. More and less fire or flood or the carelessness of men destroyed them. The record of that small, quiet matter was safe in the dark. Outside the scriptorium, the seasons turned. Autumn gave way to winter, and the high windows showed a sky that was pale and cold, and sometimes bright with the low sun. The clerks worked by candlelight in the short afternoons, and their breath made small clouds in the chill air of the stone room. Then winter gave way to spring, and the light grew stronger, and the dust showed more clearly in the shafts that fell across the desks. The clerks opened the windows when the weather allowed, and the smell of damp earth and growing things drifted in from the garden below. Summer came, and the scriptorium was warm and still, and the sound of bees could be heard through the open windows. And then autumn came again, and the cycle repeated. Year after year the chest sat in its corner, and the parchment rested in the dark, and the river flowed past the mill, and the wheel turned and the grain was ground into flour. 50 years became 60, and then 70. The archive grew, and new chests were added to the row along the wall. The older chests were moved to a smaller room at the back of the scriptorium, where the light was even dimmer and the dust settled more thickly. Simon's parchment was moved with the others, lifted carefully by a clerk who did not read its contents, and placed in a new chest in the new room. The journey was only a few feet, but it was a significant journey for a piece of paper. It marked the passage from the active archive to the deep archive, from the records that might be consulted occasionally to the records that were kept because they had always been kept, and because no one had ever decided to throw them away. In the deep archive, the darkness was more complete and the silence was deeper. The parchment rested there in its bundle with the others, waiting for a scholar who might never come, holding its small story of a miller and a remark and a quiet correction. And outside the thick stone walls, the world went on in its ordinary way, full of small matters and small errors and small resolutions, all of them eventually finding their way to some quiet place where they could rest and be forgotten. The books of canon law sat on their shelves in the library of the diocese, a room that few people ever entered and even fewer understood. The library was located in a narrow building attached to the north side of the cathedral, a structure of grey stone with a slate roof and windows that were small and high and covered with oiled linen to keep out the damp. Inside the room the light was always dim and the air was always cool and still. The smell was of old leather and older parchment, and the faint dusty sweetness of the beeswax that was used to polish the wooden shelves. The shelves themselves rose from the floor to the ceiling in orderly rows, each one filled with books of varying sizes bound in dark leather and fitted with metal clasps that held the pages closed when the books were not in use. Some of the books were large and heavy, requiring 2 hands to lift them from the shelf. Others were small and compact, designed to be carried in a traveller's satchel. All of them were written in Latin in the careful hands of scribes who had spent their lives forming letters on parchment, and all of them contained the accumulated wisdom and law and commentary of the Church over many centuries. The weight of these books was not only a physical weight, it was the weight of authority and tradition and the slow, patient work of generations. When a question arose about the proper way to understand a particular matter of faith or discipline, the answer was not invented on the spot. It was sought in the pages of these books, where earlier scholars and popes and councils had considered similar questions and recorded their judgments. The system was like a great tree, whose roots went deep into the past and whose branches spread out to cover every aspect of human life. A miller in a small village who said something slightly wrong about Latin prayers was a single leaf on one of the outermost branches. The canon law could reach him because the tree was vast and its roots were deep, and its structure was known to those who had studied its shape. The most important of these books was the Decretum of Gratian. Gratian had been a monk in Bologna in the 12th century, and he had undertaken a task that seemed impossible at the time. The Church had accumulated a vast body of law over the centuries, decrees of popes, decisions of councils, writings of the Church Fathers, letters of bishops, local customs and practices. These sources often contradicted each other, and there was no single place where a judge or a scholar could find a clear answer to a difficult question. Gratian gathered all of these scattered authorities and arranged them by topic. He placed the contradictory texts side by side and wrote commentaries that attempted to reconcile them, to show how apparent conflicts could be resolved by understanding the context or the intention behind each ruling. He called his work the Concordia Discordantium Canonum, the harmony of discordant canons, though it became known simply as the Decretum. It was not an official code of law because it had never been formally promulgated by a pope, but it was so useful and so comprehensive that it quickly became the standard textbook for the study of canon law throughout Europe. Every bishop's court and every archdeacon's tribunal and every university where law was taught had a copy of the Decretum. The copy in the library at Lewes was a large volume bound in dark brown leather with brass corners and 2 heavy clasps. It had been copied by a team of scribes in Paris some 80 years before and purchased by a previous bishop for a considerable sum. The pages were of fine parchment, thin and smooth and even in color, and the text was written in a clear, regular hand with red and blue initials marking the beginning of each new section. Around the main text, the margins were filled with glosses, smaller writing that explained difficult passages and cited other authorities and offered interpretations of the law. These glosses had been added over the years by different hands, and they formed a dense thicket of commentary that surrounded the central text like ivy growing up the trunk of an oak. A trained canonist could read the Decretum and its glosses together and find not only the rule but also the reasoning behind the rule and the exceptions to the rule and the debates among scholars about how the rule should be applied. When Master William the official had considered the case of Simon the miller, he had not needed to open the Decretum. The matter was too small and too clear to require extensive research, but his training had been shaped by the Decretum and the other books of canon law, and the distinctions he applied to Simon's case came from that training. The distinction between error and stubbornness, between rash speech and formal heresy, between simple ignorance and affected ignorance, all of these were categories that had been worked out over centuries by scholars reading and commenting on Gratian and the later collections. Master William had learned these distinctions as a young man at Oxford, and they had become part of the furniture of his mind, as natural to him as the distinctions between different types of grain were natural to Simon the miller. After the Decretum came the Decretals of Gregory IX. Pope Gregory had commissioned a new collection of canon law in the 13th century to gather the decisions and decrees that had been issued since Gratian's time. The work was done by a Dominican friar named Raymond of Penyfort, and it was promulgated in the year 1234 as the official law of the Church. It was arranged in 5 books that covered judges and courts, legal procedure, the rights and duties of clergy, marriage, and crimes and penalties. The 5th book contained the sections on heresy and error, and the procedures for inquiring into matters of speech and belief. It was in this book that the careful gradations of error were laid out, and the remedies for each were prescribed. A person who spoke from simple ignorance was to be instructed gently. A person who spoke from rashness was to be warned and corrected. A person who spoke from stubbornness and refused correction was subject to more severe measures. The law was precise and patient, and it assumed that most people who said wrong things did so because they did not know better, rather than because they wished to defy the Church. The copy of the Decretals in the Louis library was a smaller volume than the Decretum, but it was equally well made. Its leather binding was a deep reddish brown, and its clasps were of polished iron. The text was written in a smaller hand to fit more words on each page, and the glosses were more restrained, mostly references to other sections of the law rather than lengthy commentaries. A reader who knew the system could find the relevant section quickly by consulting the alphabetical index at the front of the volume, turning to the proper book and title and chapter, and reading the text along with the standard gloss that explained its application. The process was methodical and calm, like following a recipe for bread or measuring the gap between millstones. Alongside the Decretum and the Decretals stood other books that filled out the library shelves. There was the Liber Sextus, the 6th book of Decretals added by Pope Boniface VIII at the end of the 13th century to collect the laws issued since Gregory IX. There were the Clementina, the decrees of Pope Clement V published after his death. There were the Extravagantes, the laws that wandered outside the main collections and were gathered in smaller volumes. And there were the commentaries and treatises written by the great canonists, Hostiensis and Inaforth and Johannes Andrei, and many others whose names were known to scholars but not to millers. Each of these books added weight to the shelves and depth to the tradition, and another layer of careful distinction to the law. A scholar sitting in the library at Lewes on a quiet afternoon would have found the room perfectly suited to slow thought. The light through the high windows was grey and even, and it fell on the open pages without glare or shadow. The sound of the town outside was muffled by the thick stone walls to a distant murmur that did not disturb concentration. The only sounds within the room were the occasional rustle of a turning page and the soft scratch of a quill, if someone was making notes, and the faint creak of a chair when a reader shifted position. The dust motes drifted in the shafts of light like tiny slow creatures suspended in the still air. Time moved differently in the library. It moved at the pace of reading and thinking, at the pace of ink drying on parchment, at the pace of the centuries that had produced the books on the shelves. If a scholar in the library had taken down the volume of the Decretals and turned to the section on heresy and error, he would have found a long and careful discussion of the subject. The law distinguished between different kinds of incorrect belief. There was heresy properly so called, which involved a deliberate and stubborn denial of a truth that the Church had defined as essential to the faith. There was error, which involved holding an incorrect opinion without realizing that it contradicted the Church's teaching. There was suspicion of heresy, which arose when a person's words or actions gave reason to think they might hold heretical beliefs, even if they had not stated them openly. There was rash speech, which involved saying something foolish or unconsidered about matters of faith without intending to deny the truth. And there was simple ignorance, which involved not knowing the correct teaching at all. The law treated each of these categories differently, because the law was interested in the state of a person's soul and the intention behind their words. A person who spoke from ignorance needed instruction. A person who spoke from rashness needed warning. A person who spoke from error needed correction. Only the stubborn heretic who refused all correction faced the full severity of the law. This system of distinctions was not designed to trap the unwary or to punish the innocent. It was designed to bring people back to the right path with a minimum of disturbance. The canonists wrote about the law as a form of medicine for the soul, just as a physician prescribed different treatments for different illnesses, a gentle herb for a mild complaint and a stronger remedy for a serious disease. So the canon law prescribed different responses for different kinds of error. The goal was always healing and restoration. The record of Simon the Miller's case showed this principle in practice. He had spoken rashly and slightly in error. He had been summoned and instructed, and he had accepted the correction. The matter was closed, and the record was filed. The medicine had been applied, and the patient was well. The books in the library contain many such cases recorded in the commentaries and treatises. The canonists often illustrated their points with examples drawn from actual court proceedings, or from hypothetical situations designed to test the boundaries of the law. A student reading Accusations or Johannes André would encounter cases about lay people who misunderstood the sacraments or who repeated popular sayings that contained theological errors. The student would learn how to distinguish between the simple peasant who said something wrong because he had never been taught and the educated person who should have known better. He would learn to look at the circumstances, the place where the words were spoken, the audience who heard them, the intention of the speaker, the willingness to be corrected. All of these factors mattered. The law was not a blunt instrument. It was a fine set of scales that weighed each case individually. The library at Lourdes was not a large library by the standards of the great universities or the major monasteries. It held perhaps 200 volumes in total, a modest collection assembled over many decades by bishops and archdeacons who valued learning. But 200 volumes of canon law and theology and scripture was enough to answer almost any question that arose in the ordinary administration of the diocese. When Master William needed to know the proper procedure for a particular type of case, he could send a clerk to the library to consult the relevant book. When a difficult question of law arose that could not be resolved by memory alone, the books were there to be opened and read. Most of the time they sat undisturbed on their shelves, their leather bindings gathering a fine layer of dust that was wiped away once a year by a junior clerk with a soft cloth. The dust was part of the library's quiet life, settling and being removed and settling again, in a cycle as regular as the turning of the seasons. The books aged slowly in the cool, dim room. The parchment pages absorbed the moisture of the English air and released it again as the weather changed. The ink continued its slow chemical transformation from black to brown. The leather bindings grew darker and softer with the passage of time and the occasional touch of human hands. The metal clasps developed a fine patina of oxidation that protected the iron beneath. The books were cared for because they were valuable, and because they contained knowledge that could not be easily replaced. If a binding became loose, it was repaired by a craftsman who specialized in such work. If a page was torn, it was mended with thin strips of parchment and a paste made from flour and water. The books were expected to last for centuries, and they were made to do so. The purpose of all these books and all this law and all this careful distinction was not to burden the faithful with rules, but to create order out of the complexity of human life. The church was a vast community spread across many lands and many languages and many cultures. It needed a common law to hold it together, and to ensure that the same principles were applied in Lewes as in Paris and in Rome, and in the small villages of the English countryside. The canon law was that common law. It provided a framework for resolving disputes and correcting errors and guiding the faithful toward right belief and right practice. It was slow and patient, and it preferred instruction to punishment and restoration to severity. The case of Simon the Miller was a small example of how the system worked in practice. A report was made, a summons was issued, a hearing was held, testimony was taken, a finding was reached, instruction was given, and the matter was closed. The whole process was recorded on parchment and filed in a chest, and the books on the library shelves provided the principles that guided each step. If you had been able to sit in the library at Lewes on a quiet afternoon with one of the great books of canon law open before you, you would have felt the weight of that tradition in your hands. The physical weight of the volume pressing down on the reading desk was only part of it. The greater weight was the accumulation of centuries of thought and prayer and careful reasoning that had gone into the words on the pages. Every gloss in the margin represented hours of study by a scholar who had wrestled with a difficult text and tried to understand its meaning. Every citation to an earlier authority represented a link in a chain that stretched back to the scriptures and the church fathers. The system was vast and intricate, and it had been built slowly over time, like a cathedral rising stone by stone. And like a cathedral, it was not the work of any single person. It was the work of a community spread across generations, each adding their small contribution to the whole. The library was quiet. The dust drifted in the shafts of grey light. Outside the high windows, the town of Lewes went about its ordinary business, and the river flowed toward the sea, and the mill wheel turned in the village 15 miles away. The books sat on their shelves in the dimness, waiting for the next reader who would come with a question. The canon law waited in its pages for the next case that would require its careful distinctions, and somewhere in the deep archive in the smaller room at the back of the scriptorium, the folded parchment with Simon's name on it waited too, a single small leaf on the great tree of the law. A record of a quiet matter, resolved and filed and resting in the dark. The road home from Lewes was the same road you'd walked in the other direction 2 days before, but everything about it felt different now that the hearing was over and the matter was closed. The weight that had sat in your chest since the summons arrived, not a heavy weight but a small persistent one like a stone in your boot, had lifted some time during the night in the guest house, and now you walked with a lighter step. The sky was still grey and the clouds were still low and the track was still soft from the rain that had fallen through the morning, but none of it seemed to matter in the same way. You were going home to the mill and the river, and the sound of the stones and the smell of the flour and the familiar creak of the wheel. The road unrolled before you in its patient way, and you walked it one step at a time. The first hour took you past the fields where the stubble was wet and dark, and the hedgerows dripped steadily from the morning rain. The sheep were huddled in the lee of a low stone wall with their backs to the damp breeze, and they did not look up as you passed. A crow sat on a fence post and watched you with its black eye, and then lifted itself into the air with a few slow flaps, and drifted away across the field. The sound of your footsteps was the only steady noise, a soft squelch in the muddier places, and a firmer tread where the track rose onto drier ground. You did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry. The mill would be there when you arrived, and the sluice gate would hold or it would not, and either way you would deal with it in the morning. The afternoon stretched ahead of you in a long grey ribbon of time that asked nothing except that you keep walking. You thought about Thomas waiting at home. He would have kept the fire going, and he would have checked the stones, and he would have fed the pigs. He was a good boy, and he was learning the mill the same way you had learned it from your own father. You remembered standing where Thomas now stood, watching your father adjust the tension on the stones with a few careful taps of the wooden mallet, listening to the sound change from a rumble to a smooth, steady hum. Your father had been a quiet man with flour in his hair, just like you and his father before him. The mill had been in your family for as long as anyone could remember, and it would pass to Thomas and then to his children if the river kept flowing and the grain kept growing. The thought was a comfortable one. It settled into your mind like a cat curling up by the hearth. The road climbed the low ridge where you had first seen the towers of Louise on the outward journey. Now you were walking away from the town, and the towers were behind you, and the view ahead was of the familiar countryside that led toward home. You stopped at the top of the ridge, not because you were tired, but because it was the place where travelers always stop to look back or look forward. You turned and saw Luce sitting on its hill with the castle dark against the grey sky and the smoke rising from its chimneys. The town looked small and quiet from this distance. You could not see the church of St. Anne or the vestry where you had stood before Master William, or the guest house where you had slept on the straw pallet. All of that was contained within the grey cluster of roofs and walls, and it seemed already like something that had happened a long time ago. You turned back to the road ahead and began the descent into the shallow valley where the stream crossed under the stone bridge. The sound of the stream reached you before you saw it, a soft rushing that grew louder as the track dipped between the trees. The water was higher than it had been on the outward journey because of the rain, and it flowed faster over the stones, carrying small twigs and yellow leaves downstream. You stopped on the bridge and leaned on the wet parapet and looked down at the water. The kingfisher was not there today. Nothing moved except the water itself and the leaves it carried. You watched a single yellow leaf spin in a small eddy behind a stone, turning slowly around and around until the current caught it again and pulled it free. It disappeared downstream, and another leaf took its place. You stood there for a while longer than you needed to because the sound of the water was pleasant, and your legs welcomed the pause. Then you pushed yourself upright and continued along the track. The woodland was dim and wet, and the leaves were falling more steadily now. They drifted down through the still air and landed on the track and on the undergrowth, and on the surface of the puddles that had collected in the low places. Your footsteps were quieter here on the soft layer of old leaves, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the branches and the occasional rustle of a bird in the undergrowth. The wood smelled of damp earth and rotting wood, and the faint sweetness of the last mushrooms of the season. You breathed it in deeply. It was the smell of home, or near enough to home that the difference did not matter. When you emerged from the wood, the light had shifted. The grey of the sky was beginning to warm toward the softer grey that comes in the late afternoon when the sun is low behind the clouds, but still present. The fields on either side of the track were empty and still, and the distant line of trees on the horizon was a dark smudge against the paler sky. You walked on with your hands in the pockets of your tunic and your mind drifting in the way that minds drift when the body is doing something familiar and repetitive. You thought about the sluice gate and the piece of oak you would need to shape. You thought about the flour that was piling up in the storage bin. You thought about the taste of Matilda's new ale and the warmth of the fire in the hearth. These thoughts came and went like the clouds above you, and none of them stayed long enough to become a worry. The afternoon wore on, and the track led you past the familiar landmarks of the journey. The field where the stubble had been gathered into low piles. The flat stone where you had sat to eat your bread. The village where the children had played with a hoop and where the woman had hung her, washing on the line. The village was quiet now in the late afternoon lull, and you walked through it without stopping. A dog barked once from somewhere behind a cottage and then fell silent. A man was closing a gate at the edge of a field, and he raised his hand as he passed. You raised yours in return and kept walking. The final stretch of the journey was the one you knew best. The track curved around the base of a low hill and then straightened toward the river valley where your village lay. The light was definitely warmer now, a pale gold that seeped through the thinning clouds and touched the landscape with a soft glow. The grass in the fields looked greener in this light, and the wet bark of the trees had a darker, richer color. You could smell the river before you could see it, that particular smell of clean water and wet stone and the faint earthy scent of the banks. And then the village appeared below you, the church tower first, and then the roofs of the cottages, and then the mill itself, standing beside the gleam of the water. The mill wheel was turning. You could see it from the rise, the dark shape of the paddles dipping into the current and rising again. The sound reached you a moment later, that low, steady creak and splash that was the background music of your life. Smoke rose from the chimney of the mill house in a thin column that leaned with the faint breeze. Thomas had kept the fire going. The boy was doing well. He walked down the last slope and across the common green where the grass was wet and the mud was soft. The chickens were already gone to their roost, and the dog that usually slept by the well was nowhere to be seen. The village was settling into its evening quiet, the time when the work of the day was done and the work of the night had not yet begun. A few lights showed in the cottage windows, the warm orange glow of hearth fires behind oiled linen. You walked past them and turned onto the track that led to the mill. Thomas was standing in the doorway when you arrived. He had heard your footsteps on the packed earth, or perhaps he had been watching for you from the window. He did not run to meet you, because he was not that kind of boy, but he stood in the doorway with the broom in his hand, and a look of quiet relief on his face. You nodded to him and he nodded back, and that was all the greeting either of you needed. You went inside and sat down heavily on the sack of grain that served as your chair near the hearth. The fire was burning low and steady, and the warmth of it seeped into your tired legs. You pulled off your wet boots and set them near the hearth to dry. Thomas brought you a cup of water from the bucket, and you drank it slowly. You told Thomas about the hearing while the pottage warmed on the fire. You told him about the vestry and the official and the witnesses, Roger and Matilda. You told him that the matter was finished and that there was nothing to worry about. You told him that Father Oswald would help you remember the right words for the prayers and that you would sweep the church porch for a month. Thomas listened without interrupting. When you finished, he asked if it had been frightening. You thought about the question for a moment. You said that it had not been frightening, just slow and formal and a little bit tiring. You said that the official had been a calm man who listened carefully and who seemed to want only to understand what had been said. Thomas nodded and seemed satisfied with this answer. You ate your pottage from the wooden bowl with the wooden spoon. The pottage was thick with leeks and barley, and it warmed you from the inside. Thomas ate his own portion sitting on the floor near the hearth with his back against the wall. The room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the wheel turning in the dark outside. When you finished eating, you set the bowl aside and sat looking at the flames. The tiredness of the long walk was settling into your bones now, a deep, heavy tiredness that felt earned and honest. Your eyes grew heavy and your thoughts grew slow. After a while you stood up and went outside to check the sluice gate before the light failed completely. The sky was a deep grey now, with a faint band of paler light along the western horizon where the sun had set behind the clouds. The river was high from the rain, and it flowed with a stronger current than usual, pressing against the old boards of the gate. You stood there with your hands on your hips and watched the water for a long time. The gate was holding. The new board you would fit tomorrow would make it stronger, but for tonight the old wood was doing its work. The wheel turned steadily, and the sound of it was the same sound it had made every night of your life. You listened to it for a while, and then you turned and went back inside. Thomas was already in the loft, lying on his straw mattress with the blanket pulled up to his chin. You climbed the ladder and lay down on your own mattress. The thatch above you was dark, and the small window showed a square of grey sky that was slowly turning to black. You could hear the river through the window, and the creak of the wheel, and the soft sound of Thomas breathing. You lay on your back with your hands folded on your chest, and you let the sounds of the night wash over you. The river flowed past the mill in the dark. It flowed as it had flowed for thousands of years before the mill was built, and as it would flow for thousands of years after the mill was gone. The water came from the hills where the rain fell on the high ground and gathered in streams that joined together and grew into the river. It passed through villages and past fields and under bridges and over weirs. It turned mill wheels and carried boats and watered the roots of the willows that grew along its banks. And eventually it reached the sea, where it mixed with the salt water and rose into the sky as vapor and fell again as rain on the hills. The cycle was old and patient, and it did not hurry. The wheel turned in the dark. The wooden paddles dipped into the current and rose again, dripping silver lines that could not be seen because there was no light to see them by. The axle creaked in its bearings, and the great wooden cogs transferred the motion of the water to the millstones inside the building. The stones were still now because Thomas had lifted the mechanism before closing the sluice gate for the night. But the wheel continued to turn slowly in the current, not grinding anything, just moving because the water was moving and the wheel had no choice but to move with it. Inside the mill house, you slept. Your breathing was slow and even, and your face was relaxed in the way that faces relax when the mind has let go of its small burdens. The fire in the hearth burned down to embers that glowed orange and then red and then grey. The room grew cooler, and the smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. Outside the village was dark and quiet. The lights in the cottage windows went out one by one as the villagers finished their suppers and banked their fires and climbed into their beds. The dog that slept by the well curled into a tighter ball and tucked its nose under its tail. The chickens in their coop made soft clucking sounds in their sleep. The church tower stood dark against the darker sky, and the bell hung silent in its frame. The night passed in the way that nights pass when there is nothing to disturb them. The clouds thinned and broke apart, and the stars appeared in the gaps, faint and distant and entirely indifferent to the small concerns of the village below. A fox trotted along the riverbank with its nose to the ground and its ears pricked forward. It paused to the edge of the mill yard and looked at the dark shape of the building and then continued on its way. The river flowed and the wheel turned and the hours moved forward in their slow procession toward the morning. When the first grey light began to seep into the eastern sky, the birds in the thatch stirred and made their first tentative sounds. A single blackbird sang a few notes and then fell silent. The light grew stronger by imperceptible degrees, and the shapes of the trees and the mill and the church tower emerged from the darkness. The river revealed itself as a moving ribbon of grey and silver. The wheel continued to turn, its paddles now visible as dark shapes against the water. Smoke began to rise from one of the cottage chimneys as someone stirred their fire to life. You woke slowly without urgency. The sounds of the morning were familiar and comforting, and they pulled you gently from sleep. You lay for a while with your eyes open, looking at the thatch above you. Your body was rested, and the ache in your legs had faded to a faint memory. The hearing and lose was behind you now, and the sluice gate was waiting, and the grain was waiting, and the ordinary work of your life was spread out before you in a long, quiet line of days. You sat up and swung your legs over the edge of the sleeping platform. Your bare feet found the rungs of the ladder, and you climbed down to the room below. The fire was grey ash and a few small embers. You added dry sticks and blew gently until a flame caught. Thomas stirred in the loft above you, but did not wake. You put water in the pot and hung it over the growing fire, and then you went outside into the grey morning. The air was cool and damp, and it smelled of the river and the wet earth and the faint sweetness of the rotting leaves along the bank. You walked down to the sluice gate and stood looking at it. The water was still high, and the old bolts were dark with moisture, but the gate was holding. You would take the adze and the oak board and the wooden pegs, and you would make the repair today. The thought was simple and satisfying. You turned and looked at the river. It flowed past you in its steady, unhurried way, the same river that had been flowing when you were a boy and when your father was a boy, and when the first miller in your family had built the first wheel on this spot. The water that passed you now would be in the next village by midday and in the sea by the end of the week. New water would come from the hills to take its place. The cycle did not end, and it did not hurry, and it did not care about summonses or hearings or the small errors of speech that occupied the minds of men. It simply flowed. You stood there for a while longer with your hands in your pockets and your face turned toward the pale grey light of the morning. The wheel creaked behind you, and the river murmured, and the birds in the thatch began to sing in earnest. The village was waking, and the day was beginning, and you were home. You turned and walked back to the mill house where the water was beginning to bubble in the pot over the fire. Thomas was climbing down the ladder with his hair sticking up and his eyes still heavy with sleep. You poured the hot water into cups and added a few leaves of dried mint from the bunch that hung from the rafter. You sat together on the sacks of grain and drank the warm liquid and watched the light grow stronger through the open door. The river flowed on.